My parents kicked me out in 10th grade for being pregnant. 20 years later, they showed up at my gate demanding let us see the child. When I opened the door, what they heard shocked them. What child? I asked. What exactly are you talking about? My name is Camilla. I am 35 years old, and today I am a venture capitalist running a $500 million empire in Silicon Valley. But my family did not know that until they saw my face on a tabloid magazine and decided it was time to cash in on the teenage daughter they threw away. Before I dive into this absolute nightmare of a family reunion, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight back against toxic relatives who only care about your money. The deafening buzz of my estate front gate intercom pierced through the quiet of my Saturday morning. I set down my coffee, glanced at the security monitor, and froze. Standing outside my wrought iron gates were the ghosts of my past. My mother Beverly wrapped in an ostentatious fur coat that screamed fake wealth. My father Richard, red-faced and impatient. Next to them stood my older sister Sydney, the undisputed golden child of our family, clinging tightly to the arm of her husband Terrence. Terrence is an incredibly hardworking African-American man, an accomplished architect who always looked exhausted trying to keep up with Sydney and her endless financial demands. Next to this bizarre family reunion stood a bored-looking process server clutching a thick stack of legal documents. "Sign the papers, Camilla," Richard yelled aggressively through the crackling intercom speaker. "The court approved our grandparents' rights petition. Hand over the child you have been hiding from us and pay us our rightful share of the child's support." I did not panic. I did not cry. I simply pressed the gate release button and walked down my long manicured driveway to meet them face to face for the first time in 2 decades. Every step I took on the imported stone of my driveway was a testament to my survival. I had built my firm from the ground up, turning early-stage tech startups into global phenomena. I had spent 20 years transforming the frightened, bleeding 15-year-old girl they discarded into a woman made of absolute steel. They expected to find someone they could easily intimidate and bully into submission. Instead, they found a predator in her own territory. "Do not play dumb with us," Beverly screeched before I even reached the end of the paved walkway. "You were a pregnant 15-year-old disgrace when we threw you out into the freezing snow. We know you had the baby. You owe us for the emotional distress you caused this family. If I had not kicked you out that night, you never would have found the motivation to get rich. You owe your entire empire to my tough love." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. She was still exactly the same, obsessed with appearances and devoid of any actual maternal instinct. She honestly believed that abandoning a teenager in the dead of winter was some kind of heroic parenting strategy. My father Richard puffed out his chest, trying to look like the intimidating patriarch he once was. But all I saw was a desperate aging man whose own logistics business was rumored to be on the verge of bankruptcy. They were looking at me not as a daughter, but as a winning lottery ticket. "Let us see the child," Richard demanded, stepping forward as if he had the authority to barge into my home. I looked down at the legal summons the process server shoved into my hands, then back at the people who shared my DNA. "What child?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "What exactly are you talking about?" Sydney stepped forward, a nasty smirk spreading across her face. She reached into her oversized designer bag and pulled out a glossy tabloid magazine, slapping it against my chest. "Read it and weep, little sister," Sydney sneered. I glanced at the cover. There was a candid photo of me walking out of a charity gala. The bold, sensationalized headline read, "Venture capitalist billionaire Camilla leaves $500 million empire to her 20-year-old child." "The secret is out," Sydney gloated, crossing her arms defensively. "You hid your bastard kid to keep the money for yourself. But we have a legal right to our grandchild. We are taking custody and taking control of the trust fund today." I did not flinch. Instead, I bypassed my parents and Sydney, entirely turning my attention straight to Terrence. He looked deeply uncomfortable, his eyes darting between his wife and the sprawling estate behind me. "You are a brilliant architect, Terrence," I said smoothly, watching his posture stiffen. "You work 80-hour weeks to provide for Sydney and keep up her country club appearances. Tell me, did she happen to mention that she needed $50,000 last month for Beverly emergency heart surgery?" Terrence frowned, genuine confusion washing over his face. He nodded slowly, clearly wondering how I knew about their private finances. I smiled a cold, hard smile. Beverly did not have heart surgery, Terrence. I investigated. Sydney used your hard-earned money to pay off Beverly underground gambling debts. They are bleeding you dry. Terrence whipped his head towards Sydney, his jaw tight. What is she talking about? Terrence asked, his voice dangerously low. You told me the doctors needed that wire transfer immediately to save her life. Sydney's smug expression instantly evaporated, replaced by a pale, stammering panic. Terrence, baby, do not listen to her. She is just trying to cause trouble because she is a bitter, horrible person. She is trying to distract us from the fact that she has been hiding our family heir. But Terrence pulled his arm away from her grasp, stepping back. Terrence had always been an outsider to them too, despite his incredible success. As an African-American man from a working-class background who had built his own highly respected architectural firm, he had compromised his own peace to fit into their elitist, subtly racist family dynamics. He had bent over backwards to prove he was a worthy provider for their golden child. Seeing that they were exploiting his exhausting labor to fund their secret vices was the exact wake-up call he needed. The realization of her financial manipulation was hitting him in real time. He looked at Beverly, who suddenly looked very healthy for a woman who supposedly had open heart surgery just 4 weeks ago. The betrayal was written all over his face. Before I could order my security team to forcefully throw them all off my property, my cell phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a priority alert from my corporate lawyer, Jared. I answered it right there in front of them, keeping my eyes locked on my father's greedy grin. Camilla! Jared's voice sounded breathless and furious over the line. I just got off the phone with the courthouse. The judge just granted their ex parte motion based on that ridiculous tabloid leak and your parents' sworn affidavits. Your personal bank accounts are completely frozen, pending a mandatory custody and financial support hearing tomorrow morning. They are trying to drain you dry before you even step foot in a courtroom. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear. My parents were beaming, completely unaware that the trap they just set for me was about to become their own personal prison. I had survived much worse than a frozen bank account, and I was about to show them exactly why I was the most feared venture capitalist in the state. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked through the wrought iron bars of my front gate. The silence hung heavy in the crisp California air. My parents were still standing there, their faces flushed with greedy anticipation, utterly convinced they had just cornered me. They had no idea they were standing on a trapdoor I was about to swing wide open. Terrence was the only one not smiling. He stood frozen, processing the financial bomb I had just dropped on him. The $50,000 he had sweated blood to earn for his children's future had been siphoned away to cover Beverly's underground gambling debts. He turned slowly towards Sydney. The look of utter disgust on his face was absolute. He did not yell. He simply held out his hand and demanded the keys to his car. Sydney dropped her smug posture instantly. Terrence, baby, wait, she stammered, her voice shaking as she reached for his arm. It is a lie. She is just trying to manipulate us. Terrence swatted her hand away as if it burned him. He snatched the keys from her fingers and walked away without looking back. Sydney scrambled down the driveway after him, her designer heels clicking frantically on the pavement, leaving Richard and Beverly standing alone at my gate. They glared at me, trying to maintain their intimidating stance, but the cracks were already showing. We will see you in court tomorrow morning, Richard spat, jabbing a finger toward me. Bring the checkbook, Camilla. You owe us for the hell you put this family through. I did not offer them a single word in response. I simply turned my back, walked up my driveway, and signaled my security team to secure the perimeter. I walked into my sprawling, silent house, bypassing the luxurious living room and heading straight for my private garage. I got into my car and directed my driver to head immediately to the downtown headquarters of Apex Ventures. The drive gave me exactly 20 minutes to compartmentalize the rage. By the time the elevator doors opened on the top floor of my firm, my emotions were entirely locked away. I walked into the glass-walled conference room with the precision of a general preparing for war. Jared, my lead corporate attorney, was pacing furiously across the room. He had documents scattered across the large mahogany table, his tie loosened, looking more panicked than I had ever seen him in 8 years of working together. "Camilla, this is a disaster," Jared said, rushing toward me the second I walked in. They hired Marcus Vance, one of the slimiest, most aggressive family law attorneys in the state. Vance specializes in high-profile media circuses. They filed an emergency ex parte motion this morning. They convinced a judge that you are a massive flight risk, claiming you were actively attempting to hide your secret heir and liquidate your assets to avoid paying retroactive child support. I sat down at the head of the table, crossing my legs. And the judge just blindly approved, freezing my personal accounts based on a tabloid magazine cover. Vance argued that the public financial filings for your charity trust were actually a front to funnel money to a biological child, Jared explained, dragging a hand down his face. They are leaning heavily on grandparents' rights laws. They are demanding that the court establish a $10 million escrow fund immediately to secure the grandchild's well-being. Plus, they want full custody rights and compensation for emotional distress. Jared stopped pacing and planted his hands on the table, staring me dead in the eye. "Camilla, I have protected your empire for nearly a decade. Why did you never tell me you had a 20-year-old child? If we are walking into a mandatory custody and financial support hearing tomorrow morning, I need the absolute truth right now." I held his gaze without blinking. I reached into my leather briefcase and bypassed the corporate ledgers and financial projections. I pulled out a thick, heavily weathered medical file, its edges yellowed with age, secured by a thick rubber band. I dropped it onto the center of the table. The heavy thud echoed sharply against the glass walls. "I do not have a child, Jared," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "But what those monsters did to me 20 years ago is about to cost them their freedom." Jared hesitated before pulling the file toward him. He snapped the rubber band off and opened the cover. He read the first page, and I watched the color drain completely from his face. His eyes darted from the faded hospital records up to me, wide with horror. "Camilla, they threw you out when you were experiencing this." His voice was barely a whisper. "I was 15 years old," I explained, standing up and walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city skyline. "I started experiencing agonizing abdominal pain and missed my cycle. I panicked and bought a cheap drugstore pregnancy test. It was positive. I was a straight-A student, a quiet kid, and I was terrified. I went to my parents crying, begging for help. Richard slapped me across the face and called me a disgrace to his business reputation. Beverly packed my belongings in garbage bags. They shoved me out the front door into a freezing winter rainstorm and literally changed the locks while I sat on the porch bleeding." Jared looked physically sick, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the medical papers. "But the test was positive. There was no baby," I stated flatly, turning back to face him. I collapsed at a bus stop 2 miles from their house. A stranger found me unconscious and called an ambulance. They took me to a free charity clinic downtown. The doctors ran a full diagnostic ultrasound and blood work. It was ovarian choriocarcinoma. It is an incredibly rare, highly aggressive cancer tumor that secretes massive levels of the pregnancy hormone. That is what caused the false positive test. I was not pregnant. I was actively dying of cancer, and my parents threw me away like garbage rather than taking me to a doctor. Jared stared at the clinical proof of my nightmare. His legal mind was immediately calculating the devastating impact this would have in a courtroom. "Camilla, the judge is going to absolutely destroy them," he breathed out. "I want them decimated," I corrected him, tapping my finger against the glass table. "They want to drag me into court tomorrow to demand $10 million for a grandchild that does not exist. I am going to let them. I want to let them perjure themselves on the stand. I want them to swear under oath on the public record that they know for a fact I had a baby. And then I am going to drop this medical file right on the judge's desk." Jared's eyes lit up with a vicious, predatory understanding. He immediately grabbed his legal pad and started furiously mapping out our courtroom strategy. Just as he began listing the perjury traps we were going to set, my cell phone chimed sharply in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from Sydney. I opened the message to find a screenshot of a local news broadcast. Richard and Beverly were on the screen, standing outside the courthouse, dabbing their eyes with tissues, and playing the roles of heartbroken, victimized grandparents for the local media. The news ticker at the bottom of the screen read, "Billionaire daughter hiding secret heir from devastated grandparents." Underneath the photo, Sydney had typed a message dripping with arrogance. "Checkmate. Bring the checkbook tomorrow or the press gets the rest of the story." I stared at the glowing screen. I felt no sadness, no anxiety, no fear. I felt only the cold mechanical precision of a predator zeroing in on its prey. They had brought a tabloid to a war they could not possibly win. I typed my reply with steady, unwavering fingers, hitting send before tossing the phone onto the table. "I am bringing a hearse for your reputation." The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the polished oak of courtroom 4. Outside those heavy wooden doors, a swarm of reporters and camera crews were currently fighting for space, whipped into a frenzy by my family's manufactured media circus. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. I sat perfectly straight next to Jared at the defense table. My tailored charcoal suit acted as armor. Across the aisle, my parents and Sydney sat flanking their high-profile attorney, Marcus Vance. Beverly was dressed in a conservative beige twin set, completely abandoning her usual loud luxury brands to play the role of a modest, heartbroken grandmother. She dabbed her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief every time the judge looked her way. Richard kept his shoulders slumped, playing the weary patriarch who had endured unimaginable grief. Marcus Vance stood before the bench using his booming theatrical voice to paint a sickeningly sweet picture. "Your Honor, we are here today to rectify a tragic injustice." Vance began pressing a hand to his chest. "My clients, Richard and Beverly, are upstanding, loving parents who have suffered the absolute agony of being separated from their only grandchild for 20 years. Their daughter Camilla became pregnant at the tender age of 15. Out of teenage rebellion and spite, she ran away from a home filled with love and resources, depriving these devoted grandparents of the chance to nurture their own flesh and blood." I did not flinch. I kept my hands folded neatly on the table, my expression an unreadable mask. Jared was writing furiously on his legal pad, occasionally shooting me a glance to ensure I was holding steady. I was more than steady. I was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Vance paced back and forth, gesturing dramatically toward my parents. For 2 decades they searched. They mourned. They prayed for the safe return of their daughter and grandchild. And now we discover through public financial filings that Camilla has earmarked her $500 million empire for this very child. Yet she refuses to produce the heir. We have reason to believe she is actively hiding the child and liquidating assets to avoid paying the 20 years of retroactive child support my clients are owed for their emotional distress. Judge Harrison, a magistrate known for his strict traditional family values, frowned deeply. "Those are incredibly serious allegations, Mr. Vance. Do you have witness testimony to support this timeline of events and these threats of concealment?" "We do, Your Honor." Vance smiled smoothly. "I call Sydney to the stand." Sydney stood up, smoothing down her modest floral dress. She walked to the witness box, swore on the Bible with perfect solemnity, and took her seat. She looked at me, and for a fraction of a second, I saw the vicious, triumphant smirk hiding behind her carefully practiced look of sorrow. Then she turned to the judge, her lower lip trembling flawlessly. "Sydney, please tell the court what happened 20 years ago," Vance prompted gently. Sydney let out a breathy, manufactured sob. "Camilla was always jealous of me. She hated that our parents expected excellence from us. When she got pregnant in 10th grade, she completely unraveled. She tried to ruin my sweet 16 out of spite, throwing tantrums and demanding our parents focus solely on her mistake." There it was. The action-based backstory delivered right under oath. She was painting my horrific medical crisis as a teenage temper tantrum meant to overshadow her birthday party. It was the absolute epitome of the golden child and scapegoat dynamic we had grown up in, presented as sworn testimony. Sydney wiped a non-existent tear from her cheek and leaned closer to the microphone. "My parents begged her to let them help raise the baby. They offered to pay for everything, the medical bills, the baby clothes, the college funds. They just wanted to keep our family together." But Camilla laughed in their faces. Beverly let out a loud, dramatic wail from the plaintiff table, burying her face in her hands. Richard wrapped a comforting arm around her, shaking his head in mock devastation. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Sydney sniffled, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper. She told me she was going to hide the baby forever. She even threatened to sell the baby to the highest bidder, just to humiliate our family name and punish my parents for loving me. She ran away that night, and we spent years desperately looking for her. It destroyed my parents, and now my own husband Terrence left me yesterday because the stress of my sister and her cruel lies completely shattered our marriage. I felt Jared tense beside me. Sydney was not just lying. She was committing blatant documented perjury. She was digging a hole so deep that not even Vance could pull her out of it. I remained completely still, my heart beating with the cold mechanical precision of a predator. Every single lie she told was just another nail in their collective coffin. Vance turned back to the judge, raising his hands in a gesture of absolute helplessness. Your Honor, as you can see, this is a documented pattern of vindictive, destructive behavior. Camilla is a billionaire who hoards her wealth while her family suffers the consequences of her teenage rebellion. We demand the court freeze her remaining assets immediately and order her to produce the 20-year-old child today. Sydney stepped down from the stand, keeping her eyes cast downward like a martyr returning to the stakes. She retook her seat next to Beverly, gripping her mother's hand. Judge Harrison took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked visibly moved by Sydney's performance and my parents' fake tears. He turned his stern, unforgiving gaze directly onto me. The air in the courtroom grew instantly heavy, thick with the anticipation of my impending downfall. Ms. Camilla, the judge's voice boomed through the silent room, carrying the full weight of his judicial authority. The testimony we have heard today is deeply disturbing. The court takes the concealment of a child and the deliberate evasion of familial financial responsibilities very seriously. Your corporate financial disclosures clearly indicate a massive transfer of wealth intended for a 20-year-old recipient referred to as your child. He leaned over the bench, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute severity. I am warning you right now. Failure to produce the 20-year-old child mentioned in your financial filings will result in contempt of court and immediate asset seizure. Where is the child? I held the judge's severe gaze without a single tremor of fear. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the frantic scratching of reporters' pens in the gallery behind me. Marcus Vance wore a triumphant smirk, convinced his theatrical ambush had cornered me. Across the aisle, my parents leaned forward in their heavy wooden chairs, practically salivating at the prospect of my financial ruin. Sydney sat back with a satisfied, innocent expression, playing the role of the traumatized sister to absolute perfection. They had brought a tabloid headline to a legal war, and they were completely unprepared for the artillery I had waiting for them. I stood up slowly, buttoning my tailored suit jacket, with deliberate calm. I did not reach for a birth certificate. I did not pull out a trust fund ledger. I simply picked up the thick, yellowed medical file from the defense table and asked for permission to take the witness stand. Judge Harrison gave a curt nod, his expression hardening as I walked past the plaintiff's table. I ignored my family entirely, took the oath, and sat in the wooden chair, placing the heavy, weathered folder on the ledge in front of me. I do not have a child, Your Honor. I stated, my voice echoing clearly through the courtroom sound system. There is no 20-year-old heir. There is no secret grandchild for my parents to claim. Vance practically leapt out of his chair, his face turning red. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant is blatantly lying to the court. We have her corporate tax filings right here. The Apex Ventures Charitable Trust clearly designates a $10 million fund for a biological dependent. She is perjuring herself right now to avoid paying my clients their rightful restitution. Overruled. Judge Harrison barked, slamming his gavel once to silence the lawyer. Ms. Camilla, you are walking a very dangerous line. If there is no child, you need to explain the financial disclosures immediately. What is in that file? I slid the thick folder across the polished wood of the witness stand toward the bailiff, who carried it up to the judge's bench. That is my complete medical history from 20 years ago, I explained, keeping my voice utterly devoid of emotion. It contains diagnostic reports, surgical records, and pathology results from the St. Jude Charity Clinic downtown. I ask that it be entered into evidence. As for the financial filings, Mr. Vance is willfully misrepresenting that $10 million escrow is a pediatric oncology grant. The dependents listed are the child patients my firm sponsors. The tabloids spun a tax filing into a secret baby, and my family saw a winning lottery ticket. Judge Harrison opened the file. His brow furrowed as he scanned the first page. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming through the overhead vents. 20 years ago, I was a 15-year-old honor roll student. I began turning my gaze toward Richard and Beverly. They immediately stiffened in their seats. I started experiencing agonizing abdominal pain. It was so severe I could barely stand, and my cycle completely stopped. Terrified and confused, I went to a local drugstore and bought a cheap pregnancy test. It came back positive. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Vance crossed his arms, looking incredibly smug, assuming I was just confirming his entire case on the record. I was just a kid. I continued, my voice ringing with cold, unwavering authority. I was frightened out of my mind. I did exactly what a child is supposed to do. I went to my parents. I walked into their pristine living room crying and begged them to take me to a doctor. I begged them for help. I paused, letting my eyes lock onto my father. Richard swallowed hard, a sudden sheen of sweat breaking out on his forehead. He realized exactly where this testimony was going, but he was powerless to stop it. My father did not offer to help raise a baby. I testified, dismantling Sydney's fabricated story piece by piece. He did not offer to pay for medical bills or college funds. He struck me across the face so hard I hit the floor. He called me a worthless whore who was going to ruin his logistics business by bringing a scandal to his doorstep. My mother, Beverly, did not offer me comfort. She went upstairs, packed my clothes into black plastic garbage bags, and dragged me to the front door. They threw me out into a freezing winter rainstorm. I sat on the porch, bleeding and crying in agony, while they literally changed the deadbolts on the other side of the door. "Objection!" Vance shouted, his voice pitching higher with sudden panic. "This is irrelevant hearsay designed to distract the court from the core issue of custody." "Sit down, Mr. Vance!" Judge Harrison snapped his eyes, never leaving the medical file in his hands. The color was rapidly draining from the judge's face as he flipped to the second page of the official hospital records. The hostility that had been directed at me just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by profound shock. "Continue your testimony, Miss Camilla." I dragged my garbage bags 2 miles in the freezing rain until I collapsed at a bus stop. I said, ensuring every reporter in the room caught every single word. A stranger found me unconscious and called an ambulance. I was transported to a free clinic because I had no insurance, no money, and no family. The doctors there ran a full diagnostic ultrasound and comprehensive blood work. I turned to look at my parents. Beverly was clutching Richard's arm, her knuckles entirely white. The smug confidence had completely evaporated from their faces. They were staring at me with genuine, unadulterated terror. "They did not find a heartbeat," I stated clearly. "They did not find a baby. I was not pregnant, Your Honor." The silence in the room was absolute, suffocating and heavy. "I had ovarian choriocarcinoma," I announced, dropping the ultimate medical bombshell into the dead quiet of the courtroom. "It is an incredibly rare, highly aggressive cancer tumor. That specific type of tumor secretes massive levels of HCG, the exact same hormone produced during pregnancy. That is what caused the false positive test." Gasps erupted from this gallery. Reporters literally dropped their pens, scrambling to record the twist. A loud clamor of shocked whispers broke out across the wooden benches as the public realized exactly what my family had done. I had a tumor, not a baby, I declared, my voice slicing through the rising noise of the courtroom like a blade. I was bleeding out, dying of aggressive cancer on the streets, while my loving parents were busy changing the locks to protect their country club reputation. Judge Harrison stared at the pathology reports bearing my name, the official clinic stamps, and the surgical records detailing the emergency removal of the tumor that had nearly ended my life at 15. He slowly lowered the file, his hands trembling slightly against the wood of his bench. He looked past me, fixing his gaze on Richard, Beverly, and Sydney. The three of them looked as though they had just been struck by lightning. Beverly had gone a sickly shade of ash gray, her mouth hanging open in silent horror as the cameras flashed behind her. Richard was staring blankly ahead, his chest heaving as the reality of his impending destruction set in. Sydney sat frozen in her chair, the fake tears completely gone, her eyes wide with the realization that she had just committed felony perjury to demand custody of a cancer tumor. The judge's face morphed from stern judicial authority into a mask of pure, unadulterated wrath. Judge Harrison threw the medical file onto his desk with a sharp crack that made Sydney jump in her seat. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated wrath. He stared down at Marcus Vance, who was currently gripping the edges of his podium as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from beneath him. "Mr. Vance." Judge Harrison began, his voice dangerously low. "I am looking at official, authenticated medical records from St. Jude Clinic. These documents confirm a diagnosis of ovarian choriocarcinoma. They confirm emergency surgical intervention. They confirm a pathology report of a malignant tumor. What they do not confirm under any circumstances is the existence of a child." Vance swallowed hard, the slick confidence entirely wiped from his features. "Your Honor, I was not made aware of this evidence." "You presented a sworn witness to this court." Judge Harrison roared, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "You allowed this young woman to sit on that stand and testify under penalty of perjury that she witnessed her sister threatening to sell a non-existent infant. You allowed your clients to file an emergency ex parte motion demanding $10 million based on an entirely fabricated premise. You have weaponized my courtroom to facilitate a blatant, malicious extortion attempt against a woman who was fighting for her life. Your Honor, my clients assured me the timeline was accurate." Vance tried to interject, visibly sweating now. He took a hasty step away from Richard and Beverly, desperate to distance himself from the sinking ship. "Save it for the disciplinary hearing, counselor," the judge snapped. He turned his furious gaze toward my family. Sydney was shaking violently. The realization that she had just committed a felony on public record was crashing down on her. She looked at Richard for help, but my father was paralyzed. The grand patriarch of the family was completely immobilized by the destruction of his master plan. Beverly sat with her mouth open, staring at the medical file on the judge's bench as if it were a venomous snake. Judge Harrison picked up his gavel. "The emergency ex parte motion is denied. The grandparents' rights petition is dismissed with extreme prejudice. The freeze on Ms. Camilla's personal and corporate assets is lifted immediately. Furthermore, I am directing the court clerk to forward the transcripts of today's proceedings directly to the district attorney's office. I am officially recommending that perjury and fraud charges be brought against Sydney, Richard, and Beverly." He slammed the gavel down like a thunderclap. The sound sealed their fate. The reporters in the gallery erupted into a frenzy of frantic whispering and typing, eager to be the first to publish the spectacular downfall of the family who tried to con a billionaire. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the absolute finality of the moment. Beside me, Jared let out a long, heavy breath, leaning back in his chair with a look of profound awe. He closed his legal pad. We did not even need to present a defense. The trap had snapped shut exactly as planned. I stood up slowly, my posture impeccable. I reached out and carefully slid the medical file back into my leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut. Every eye in the courtroom was glued to me. I had walked in as their prey, and I was walking out as their executioner. I turned and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy silence was broken only by the sharp, confident click of my heels against the polished hardwood floor. As I approached the plaintiff's table, I paused. Richard stared straight ahead, too cowardly to meet my eyes. Sydney was weeping loudly, real tears of sheer terror running down her face, entirely ignored by the parents who usually rushed to comfort her. Beverly finally looked up at me. Her face was a portrait of absolute defeat. She looked old, fragile, and utterly exposed. The glamorous grandmother facade had been ripped away, leaving only the bitter, cruel woman she truly was. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face just inches from hers. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The quiet precision of my words carried enough devastation. "You always loved the spotlight, Beverly," I whispered, holding her terrified gaze. "Enjoy the glow." Beverly physically recoiled, sinking lower into her wooden chair, as if the words had struck her. She covered her face with her hands, hiding from the harsh glare of the reality she had created. I straightened up and continued my walk toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom. The victory tasted metallic and cold, but it was absolute. I had severed the final rotting tie to the people who shared my DNA. My empire was secure. My past was buried. I reached for the brass handle of the door, ready to walk out into the bright California sun and leave them to the legal slaughterhouse. Just as my fingers brushed the cool metal, the doors violently burst open from the other side. I took a quick step back as a breathless, red-faced man in a sharp pinstripe suit shoved his way into the courtroom. He completely ignored the bailiff reaching for his arm and marched straight down the center aisle, waving a thick stack of legal documents in the air. I recognized him instantly. It was Arthur Sterling, the lead corporate attorney for my father's logistics company. "Your Honor, wait!" Sterling shouted, his voice cracking with exertion as he bypassed the gallery and stopped right behind Richard's chair. "Do not dismiss the asset freeze. We are filing a new separate injunction immediately." Judge Harrison, who had been halfway out of his chair to recess the court, froze. He glared down at the interrupting attorney with fresh outrage. "Who are you, and how dare you interrupt my courtroom?" Arthur Sterling, representing Richard's corporate holdings, he panted, slamming the documents onto the plaintiff's table. "This is no longer a family court matter, Your Honor. This is corporate theft." Jared was instantly on his feet beside me, his legal instincts firing up. "Objection. This hearing is concluded. Any corporate grievances belong in civil court, not here." "It belongs here because the assets she controls were stolen from her family," Sterling yelled back, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. He looked up at the judge, his face flushed with desperate triumph. "Camilla embezzled her entire startup capital from the family trust 5 years ago. We have the forensic accounting. We have the bank transfers. And, Your Honor, we have the signed contract proving she funneled millions of her father's money to build her own firm." The entire courtroom went dead silent. The reporters stopped typing. Judge Harrison froze, his hand hovering over his gavel. Richard slowly lifted his head, a sickening familiar grin creeping back onto his face. Arthur Sterling stood panting at the plaintiff's table, his manicured hands pressing a thick stack of papers flat against the wood. The sickening familiar grin on my father's face widened. Richard had just played his trump card. He knew he could not win the moral argument regarding my medical history, so he pivoted to the one arena where he felt absolute supremacy: corporate warfare. Judge Harrison took the documents from the bailiff, his expression tightening with renewed irritation. "What exactly am I looking at, Mr. Sterling?" "This court just dismissed a fraudulent custody claim. You are skating on incredibly thin ice. This is a binding promissory note and equity transfer agreement, Your Honor." Sterling replied, his breathing finally steadying. 5 years ago, Camilla utilized a shell corporation to siphon $5 million from the Richard and Beverly Logistics Family Trust. That stolen capital was the seed money used to launch Apex Ventures. Per the strict terms of this contract signed by Camilla herself, failure to repay the principal within 48 months triggers an automatic default. The penalty is the immediate transfer of 51% of all Apex Ventures shares directly to Richard. She is in default. Jared was out of his chair in a fraction of a second. He snatched our copy of the filing from the bailiff. He flipped through the crisp pages, his eyes scanning the dense legalese with rapid precision. I leaned in close, staring at the final page. There it was, my signature. The elegant, sweeping curve of the C, the sharp, distinct angles of the M's. It was absolutely flawless. "It is a forgery," I whispered to Jared, my voice barely audible over the frantic murmur of the press gallery behind us. "I never took a single dime from them. I built Apex with independent venture capital." Jared's jaw locked tight. He adjusted his glasses, holding the paper up to the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom. "It is a brilliant forgery," he murmured back, tapping a manicured finger against the bottom corner. "Look at the notary stamp. It is legitimate. They compromised a notary, or found someone on their payroll to backdate the official stamp. We can prove it is fake in discovery, but right now it holds immense legal weight." "Your Honor," Jared announced, projecting his voice across the room to cut through Sterling's smug silence. "This document is a complete fabrication. My client has never engaged in any financial transactions with her family's trust. This is a desperate retaliatory tactic designed to extort my client after their initial perjury was exposed." Sterling scoffed loudly, slamming a hand against his podium. "The signature is notarized, and the funds were routed through offshore accounts, matching the exact dates of her initial corporate filings. We have the forensic accounting trail. We request an immediate transfer of this dispute to the commercial docket and a temporary injunction against Camilla. We demand her voting rights at Apex Ventures be suspended until ownership is formally resolved. Judge Harrison rubbed his temples. The righteous anger from the medical file revelation was still evident on his face, but his hands were legally tied by standard procedure. A notarized corporate contract presented a massive jurisdictional hurdle that could not simply be waved away. I am disgusted by the blatant perjury regarding the medical records, Judge Harrison stated coldly, looking directly at Richard and Beverly. Do not think that matter is closed. However, a contested, notarized equity contract falls under corporate jurisdiction. I cannot dismiss this offhand in family court. I am ordering this specific financial dispute transferred to the commercial court for immediate review. The judge banged his gavel with heavy finality. Until the commercial court convenes, I am granting a 48-hour temporary injunction. Ms. Camilla, your voting rights and executive authority at Apex Ventures are frozen for 2 days to prevent any liquidation of disputed assets. Court is adjourned. I did not wait for the bailiff to dismiss us. I stood up, grabbed my briefcase, and marched down the center aisle. The reporters were shouting questions, flashing cameras directly in my face, but I kept my gaze fixed on the heavy oak doors. I pushed through them, stepping out into the expansive marble hallway of the courthouse. The air outside was thick with the impending storm of a corporate bloodbath. Before I could reach the elevators, a heavy hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around instinctively, slapping the hand away. Richard stood there towering over me. His previous panic inside the courtroom had completely vanished, replaced by the arrogant, narcissistic swagger I remembered from my darkest childhood memories. He straightened his expensive silk tie, looking down his nose at me. Sydney stood a few paces behind him, her fake tears wiped away, a vicious little smile playing on her lips. "You think you are so smart?" Richard sneered, his voice dropping to a gravelly, menacing pitch designed to intimidate. "You actually thought you could outmaneuver me in a courtroom? I taught you everything about business. I built an empire while you were still figuring out how to tie your shoes. You are just a girl playing dress-up in a tailored suit." I stared back at him, my expression carved from ice, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. "You taught me that leverage is everything, Richard. You just bought yourself 48 hours. Enjoy the countdown." Richard let out a harsh, barking laugh. "In 48 hours, I will strip your company down to the studs. I will sell your assets, fire your board, and erase your name from the letterhead. You should have stayed out in the freezing rain." He turned on his heel, signaling for Sydney to follow him. They walked toward the opposite bank of elevators, moving with the synchronized, predatory confidence of sharks smelling blood in the water. I pulled out my phone, dialing my chief operating officer before I even stepped into my car. The war had escalated. 1 hour later, the sleek glass-walled lobby of Apex Ventures headquarters was completely silent. The usual energetic hum of startup pitches and ringing phones had ceased entirely. I stood behind the reception desk, flanked by my head of security and my lead developers. The temporary injunction meant I could not legally authorize trades, move capital, or execute executive orders. My hands were legally tied behind my back in my own building. The polished steel doors of the private executive elevator chimed loudly. The door slid open. Richard stepped out first, flanked by 4 massive private security contractors wearing tactical earpieces. Sydney stepped out right behind him, holding a stack of legal binders and wearing an obnoxiously bright designer dress, treating my corporate headquarters like her personal shopping mall. Arthur Sterling flanked their right side, holding up the judge's signed injunction order like a shield. Richard surveyed the expansive modern office. He looked at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, the multi-million-dollar art installations, and the dozens of panicked employees peeking out from their glass cubicles. His eyes gleamed with raw, unadulterated greed. "Clear the executive floor." Richard barked, his voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. He did not even look at me as he issued the command. He pointed to my head of security. "You work for me now. Escort this woman off the premises immediately. We are executing a hostile takeover of Apex Ventures." Sydney stepped up to the front desk, slamming her stack of binders down right in front of me. She leaned across the polished counter, her eyes wide with malicious delight. "Pack your desk, sister," Sydney whispered, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness. "I want your corner office." I looked at Sydney, whose face was flushed with the greedy anticipation of a scavenger claiming a fresh kill. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply gestured to the sleek glass-walled office at the end of the hall. "Take it," I replied, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of the panic she desperately wanted to see. "I hope you find the chair comfortable, Sydney. You will not be sitting in it for long." Richard did not waste a single second. He treated my corporate sanctuary like a conquered territory, practically vibrating with the thrill of his hostile invasion. He snapped his fingers, and his 4 massive private security contractors fanned out across the executive floor. They moved with aggressive precision, violently unplugging monitors, seizing hard drives, and physically blocking my employees from their workstations. Richard marched down the central corridor, pointing a thick, manicured finger at my lead developers, financial analysts, and administrative staff. "You are terminated!" Richard barked, his voice booming off the floor-to-ceiling windows and shattering the usual quiet focus of the office. "Box your personal items and get out. You are fired. If anyone touches a secure server or attempts to wipe a hard drive, I will have you arrested for corporate espionage. This building belongs to me now." My staff froze, absolute terror flashing in their eyes. They clutched their laptops and looked to me, their CEO, for guidance. I caught the eye of my lead analyst, David, and gave him a slow, deliberate nod. I needed them to comply temporarily. I needed Richard to feel invincible, to believe his ambush had worked flawlessly. The chaos swelled as filing cabinets were slammed shut. Personal belongings were hurriedly shoved into cardboard boxes, and security guards hovered intimidatingly over my people. Just as Richard was threatening to have my chief of staff physically dragged to the elevators, the polished steel doors chimed again. Terrence stepped onto the floor. Sydney's husband looked completely out of his depth. He wore a rumpled beige suit and carried an expression of profound, agonizing discomfort. Terrence was a high school history teacher, a man who had always seemed too quiet, too empathetic, and too genuine to survive in my family's vicious orbit. He stared at the unfolding hostile takeover, his eyes widening in horror as he watched Richard's hired thugs manhandle a young intern away from her desk. "Richard, stop!" Terrence pleaded, stepping forward and raising his hands in a desperate, placating gesture. "You cannot just storm in here and terrorize innocent people. This is a legal dispute, not a mob shakedown. Let the commercial courts handle the transition of power." Before Richard could even turn around to address him, Sydney pivoted on her heels and marched right up to her husband. Her sweet, victimized facade vanished in a millisecond, replaced by a terrifying, unhinged fury. "Are you seriously defending her?" Sydney screamed, jabbing her finger hard into Terrence's chest, forcing him to take a step backward. "After everything she has done to us, Camilla is a thief. She embezzled millions from my father to build this entire company. She is actively stealing our kids' generational wealth. This building, these assets, they belong to our children, Terrence. If you had any spine at all, you would be helping my father secure what is rightfully ours, instead of crying over some fired secretaries." Terrence recoiled, absorbing the verbal abuse like a man who had endured it 1,000 times before. The gaslighting was so intensely concentrated, it was almost suffocating. Sydney was using their children as human shields, weaponizing his paternal instincts to justify her absolute greed. She turned back to the reception desk, loudly demanding the master server passwords from a terrified IT technician. Terrence stood frozen for a moment, his shoulders slumped in defeat before catching my eye. He walked over to me, keeping his head down to avoid drawing Richard's attention. He gently pulled me aside, stepping into the shadow of a large decorative pillar near the break room. His face was etched with deep, exhausting sorrow. "I don't want any part of this," Camilla, Terrence whispered, his voice cracking with genuine distress. "But Sydney says you stole from her. I just want to protect my kids." I looked at him, truly seeing the toll the marriage had taken on him. Terrence was not malicious. He was a good, decent man, completely trapped in Sydney's toxic web, slowly being suffocated by her relentless manipulation. He genuinely believed he was protecting his family from a corporate predator because Sydney had fed him a masterful diet of lies. "Terrence," I said quietly, ensuring my voice carried only to him, "I did not steal a single dime. That contract is a brilliant forgery. Your wife and her father are currently committing corporate fraud, and they are using you as collateral damage. I need you to step back, stay completely quiet, and watch exactly what happens next. You are about to see the real Richard." Terrence swallowed hard, giving a tight, almost imperceptible nod. He stepped back against the textured wall, fading into the background as the hostile takeover raged on around us. At the far end of the hall, Richard had bypassed the smaller executive suites and marched directly into my private boardroom. It was the nerve center of Apex Ventures, a massive room wrapped in smart glass with a pristine marble conference table running down the center. Richard did not bother sitting in the plush guest chairs. He walked straight to the head of the table and dropped his heavy frame into my custom leather CEO chair. He kicked his expensive Italian loafers up onto the polished marble, interlaced his fingers behind his head, and began spinning around arrogantly. He looked like a feudal king claiming his throne after a bloody conquest. He spotted me standing in the hallway and stopped spinning, leveling a look of absolute dripping contempt at me. "Pack your desk, little girl," Richard commanded, his voice projecting clearly through the open double doors, heavy with narcissistic misogyny. I did not pack my desk. I walked deliberately down the hallway, the sharp click of my heels silencing the surrounding chaos. I stepped over the threshold into the boardroom. My head of security, who had been waiting patiently for my signal, immediately stepped out into the hallway and pulled the heavy glass doors shut behind me. I engaged the electronic deadbolt. The loud mechanical click echoed through the room, sealing Richard and me inside. Richard's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He dropped his feet from the table, suddenly hyper-aware that the smart glass walls had instantly frosted over, turning completely opaque and cutting off all visual and audio access from the outside. We were entirely alone in a soundproof vault. I walked over to the master control panel on the wall. I hit a single button, lowering the blackout blinds over the frosted glass and turning on the massive overhead projector. The screen hummed to life, casting a stark, bright glow across Richard's confused face. I turned to look at my father, my expression perfectly serene and utterly lethal. "I won't fight the fake contract, Richard," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Let's talk about your logistics company instead." Richard leaned back in my custom leather chair, a harsh, dismissive bark of laughter erupting from his chest. The sound bounced off the frosted smart glass walls, trapped entirely within the soundproof vault I had just sealed us inside. He crossed his arms over his expensive, bespoke suit, radiating the arrogant certainty of a man who believed he held all the cards. "My logistics company," Richard mocked, shaking his head as if dealing with a petulant toddler. "You are completely delusional, Camilla. My company is a titan in the global supply chain industry. I have commercial shipping contracts that span 3 continents. You are locked in a room trying to deflect from the fact that I just legally seized your little venture capital pet project. I have the signed promissory note. You have absolutely nothing. You are grasping at straws because you know you have lost." I did not raise my voice. I did not break eye contact. I simply raised my right hand and pressed the small button on the master remote. The massive overhead projector hummed to life, beaming a brilliant high-definition image onto the glass wall directly behind me. The sudden burst of light washed over Richard's face, illuminating the involuntary defensive twitch in his jaw. Displayed on the wall was a highly classified, comprehensive internal balance sheet. It was an absolute bloodbath of red ink, plummeting profit margins and defaulted vendor payments. "You were a titan, Richard," I corrected, pacing slowly and deliberately in front of the illuminated screen. 20 years ago, you built something impressive, but the market evolved, global technology advanced, and your massive ego refused to adapt. Your logistics company has been failing for a decade, Dad. You spent 10 long years bleeding capital, losing vital contracts to modernized competitors, and secretly leveraging your own personal assets just to make payroll and keep up appearances at your country club. Richard's hands tightened on the armrests of my chair. The smug, victorious sneer faltered quickly, replaced by a furious, panicked scowl. He leaned forward, his eyes darting across the projected numbers. "Those are illegally obtained corporate documents," he snarled, his booming voice echoing harshly. "I will have you arrested for corporate espionage before the sun goes down. You have no idea what you are looking at. You do not understand complex corporate debt structuring." "They are not stolen," I replied smoothly, pressing the remote again. The slide transitioned instantly to a massive 50-page commercial loan contract. The signatures at the bottom of the screen were crystal clear. Richard's bold, aggressive script sat right next to a heavy corporate notary seal. When the traditional banks finally looked at your real numbers and stopped returning your calls, you grew desperate, I explained, watching the blood slowly begin to drain from his face. You needed an immediate massive injection of raw capital to keep the lights on and maintain the illusion of your immense wealth. You took out a $15 million lifeline loan from Blackwood. You thought you were dealing with faceless bankers in a high-rise office. You thought you were outsmarting a faceless private equity firm. Richard scoffed loudly, attempting to recover a fraction of his shattered bravado. He waved a dismissive hand at the projection. Private equity loans are standard business practice for a company of my scale. I secured mezzanine capital to optimize our supply chain routes. The debt is perfectly manageable. Blackwood is a massive, aggressive institutional hedge fund. You pointing out my corporate debt changes absolutely nothing about your current situation, Camilla. I answer to the board of directors at Blackwood, not to an ungrateful exiled daughter playing CEO. I stopped pacing. I stood directly at the end of the long marble table, resting my hands on the cool surface, leaning in to look him dead in the eyes. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and suffocating. That is where you are catastrophically wrong, I stated, my voice dropping to a dangerous, hushed register. I did not just build Apex Ventures when I came to this city. I built an entire diversified network of financial holdings. 3 years ago, when the Blackwood Fund was quietly restructuring their leadership, I executed an aggressive buyout through a series of offshore holding companies. I am the silent, absolute majority owner of the Blackwood Fund. You do not answer to a board of faceless bankers, Richard. You answer to me. I own your debt. I own your company. Richard fell back against the leather chair as if he had been physically struck. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His chest began to heave, his breathing turning shallow and rapid. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He was sitting in my chair in my building, surrounded by my security, realizing that the very foundation of his entire life was resting in the palm of my hand. You are lying, he breathed out, his voice hoarse and stripped of all its usual booming authority. That is impossible. Blackwood is a ruthlessly strict institutional lender. They audit everything. They are, I agreed, clicking the remote to the final, most devastating slide, which is why their loan covenants are incredibly specific regarding the allocation of capital. This $15 million loan was strictly earmarked for fleet modernization, technological infrastructure upgrades, and employee retention. I pointed to the highlighted section on the screen. It was a forensic accounting map tracing a series of wire transfers from his logistics corporate account directly into a private real estate escrow fund. You did not modernize your fleet. I continued, delivering the fatal blow with surgical precision. You did not upgrade your tech. You violated the loan terms when you siphoned company funds to buy Sydney her luxury mansion. You took millions of dollars meant to save the jobs of your blue-collar workers, and you used it to buy a 6-bedroom estate in the Hamptons so your golden child could play house. You committed federal commercial fraud to spoil the daughter you actually kept. Richard gripped his chest, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked at the routing numbers projected on the wall, the undeniable ironclad proof of his massive financial crimes. He had committed severe fraud to maintain Sydney's extravagant lifestyle, completely unaware that his discarded daughter was the one holding the receipts. It was an advance on her inheritance, Richard stammered blindly, frantically trying to spin the unspinnable. It was an internal family transfer. I am the CEO. I have discretionary authority over capital expenditures. You committed embezzlement, I corrected sharply, stepping away from the table and walking toward the glass door to unlock the deadbolt. You defrauded a private equity firm. The contract you signed contains an incredibly strict misappropriation clause. I do not need a 48-hour commercial court review to enforce it. I am triggering the default right now. I placed my hand on the electronic lock, looking back at the man who had thrown me into the freezing rain 20 years ago. The penalty is immediate loan recall. I said, my tone absolute and merciless. You have 24 hours to pay me $15 million in cash, or I seize every asset you own, including the house you're sleeping in. I watched the remaining color drain from Richard's face. The mighty patriarch, the man who had controlled our family with an iron fist and an open checkbook for my entire life, was suddenly gasping for air in my custom leather chair. I did not offer him a glass of water. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply turned my back on him, pressed the wall panel to lift the blackout blinds, and deactivated the electronic deadbolt. The heavy glass doors slid open with a soft hiss, reconnecting us to the chaotic energy of the executive floor. Richard stumbled out of the boardroom a moment later. He looked like a man who had just survived a catastrophic car crash. He braced himself against the doorframe, his expensive bespoke suit suddenly looking a full size too big. His breath came in ragged, uneven pulls. Sydney marched up to him instantly, her arms crossed tight across her chest, completely oblivious to his physical state. She was practically vibrating with malicious excitement. "Well," she demanded, tapping her designer heel aggressively against the hardwood floor, "did you fire her? How quickly can we get the IT department to transfer the master server access? I want my interior designer in here by tomorrow morning to rip out this awful modern aesthetic." Richard did not answer. He stared blankly at his favorite daughter, his jaw working silently as his mind short-circuited under the weight of his total financial ruin. "Dad!" Sydney snapped, her voice rising an octave, a shrill note of panic finally creeping into her tone. "What is wrong with you? Call your security team to throw her out. Do not just stand there." Arthur Sterling, ever the corporate parasite, stepped forward and grabbed Richard's arm, shaking him slightly. "Richard, what did she say in there? What is the status of the commercial injunction?" "She owns it," Richard whispered, his voice trembling so violently it barely carried over the ambient noise of the stunned office. "She owns the Blackwood Fund, the entire 15 million. She triggered the default. We have 24 hours, Arthur. 24 hours before she seizes everything." The words hit the group like a physical shockwave. Beverly, who had just emerged from the private elevator to join the victory lap, dropped her luxury handbag. The heavy thud echoed through the suddenly quiet lobby. "What do you mean she owns Blackwood?" Beverly shrieked, rushing forward to grab her husband's lapels. "Richard, tell me you are joking right now." "The logistics company, the estate, our private accounts." "Everything," Richard confirmed, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately avoiding my gaze. "She holds the paper on all of it. We are in absolute default. There is no legal maneuvering out of this." Sydney physically recoiled, her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The realization of her impending poverty was a visceral blow. "The Hamptons house." Sydney gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been shot. "My country club memberships, the children's private school tuition. You used corporate funds to pay for those? If she seizes the company accounts, what happens to my house?" "It is gone, Sydney," I stated clearly, walking out of the boardroom to join the gathering. "Every single asset purchased with stolen capital is subject to immediate seizure. I suggest you start packing your designer bags tonight." Sydney let out a guttural, terrifying scream. She looked around wildly, her eyes darting like a cornered animal seeking an escape route. The illusion of her untouchable wealth had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Her gaze locked onto Terrence, who was standing quietly near the reception desk. His face was a portrait of quiet horror as the reality of his wife's family was laid bare in front of a room full of strangers. Sydney rushed at him, her manicured hands grabbing the lapels of his rumpled beige suit. "Terrence, you have to fix this!" she demanded, violently shaking him. Terrence looked down at her, his expression a mix of profound pity and absolute revulsion. "Fix what, Sydney? Your father committed federal fraud. You used stolen money to fund a lifestyle we could never actually afford. How exactly am I supposed to fix a $15 million corporate crime? Mortgage. Your architectural firm?" Sydney screamed at him right in the middle of the Apex lobby, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of dignity. "Liquidate your retirement. Call your parents and tell them to sell their property in Vermont. You have to save my parents. You have to save our house." My employees, who had been holding their breath, stared in stunned silence at the spectacular implosion of the family's golden child. Terrence gently but firmly pried Sydney's fingers off his jacket. He took a deliberate step back, putting a physical boundary between himself and the madness. Absolutely not, he said, his voice remarkably steady despite the chaos. That firm took me 10 years of relentless work to build. Those retirement accounts are explicitly designated for our children's future, for their college education and their security. I am not bankrupting our kids to pay off your father's fraudulent debts. Sydney's face flushed a deep, mottled red. Her features contorted into a snarl so vicious it made her look entirely unrecognizable. You coward, she hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. I should have known you would abandon us when things got difficult. You are a weak, pathetic excuse for a husband. You are a useless provider. I always knew I married beneath me. Terence absorbed the verbal blows without flinching. The insult seemed to bounce right off him, solidifying a decision he had clearly been struggling with for years. He looked at Richard shivering in the corner, at Beverly, weeping over her dropped handbag, and finally at his wife, who was currently demanding he ruin his own life to save her illusion of grandeur. I am going home to pack my things and get the kids, Terence said quietly. My lawyer will contact you tomorrow. He turned his back on her and walked toward the elevator bank. Sydney screamed his name, a shrill, commanding shriek that expected immediate obedience, but Terence did not even break his stride. The elevator doors opened, he stepped inside, and the polished steel slid shut, severing him from her toxic orbit. I did not stick around to watch Richard and Beverly comfort their hysterical daughter. I gestured for my head of security to escort the trespassing family off my floor, then slipped into the private executive elevator. I hit the button for the subterranean parking garage. The air down there was cool and smelled faintly of motor oil and damp concrete. I stepped out into the dim fluorescent lighting and walked briskly down the row of parked luxury vehicles. I spotted Terence standing next to his modest sedan. He had his keys in his hand, but he was not moving. He was just staring blankly at the concrete wall, his shoulders rising and falling with heavy, jagged breaths. The realization that his entire marriage was built on a financial lie was crushing him. I approached quietly, my heels clicking softly against the pavement. He turned his head sharply, his eyes red and exhausted. I did not come down here to gloat, Terence, I said, maintaining a respectful distance. He let out a hollow, humorless laugh. You have every right to. I stood by while she dragged your name through the mud. I let her convince me you were the villain. I was so incredibly blind. You were manipulated, I corrected him smoothly. My family has spent decades perfecting the art of psychological warfare. You were just collateral damage in their desperate bid to maintain power. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a sleek black USB drive. I stepped forward and held it out to him. Terence looked down at the device, hesitation written all over his face. You're a good father, Terence, I said, ensuring he heard the absolute sincerity in my tone. Don't let them drag you down. Look at this before you sign anything. He slowly reached out and took the small drive, his fingers brushing against mine. His fingers closed over the cold metal of the drive. The sharp click of my heels faded into the cavernous concrete of the parking garage, leaving him entirely alone. Terence stared at the small black device resting in his palm. It felt heavier than a brick. For years, he had operated under the assumption that his wife was simply difficult, a product of her spoiled upbringing, but fundamentally committed to their family. That illusion was currently hanging by a thread. He unlocked his modest sedan, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. He did not start the engine. Instead, he reached into the back seat, grabbed his leather messenger bag, and pulled out his work laptop. The screen booted up, casting a pale, harsh light across his exhausted features. He stared at the USB port for a long, agonizing minute. Plugging it in meant crossing a threshold. It meant admitting that the woman he shared a bed with was a stranger. With a sharp intake of breath, he shoved the drive into the port. A single folder appeared on his desktop. It was titled simply Internal Audit. Terence double-clicked the folder. A massive, heavily encrypted PDF document opened, bearing the official watermark of Apex Ventures' top forensic accounting firm. He began to scroll. The initial pages outlined exactly what Camilla had stated in the boardroom. The transfer of $15 million from the Blackwood Fund, the blatant violation of loan covenants, the funneling of corporate cash to purchase Sydney's sprawling Hamptons estate. It was all there in undeniable black and white. But Terence was a pragmatic man. He knew Richard was corrupt. What he was not prepared for was the second section of the report. He scrolled down to a subfolder labeled with the names of his two young children. His heart rate spiked. His chest tightened painfully as he opened the attached bank statements. For the past decade, Terence had practically killed himself building his architectural firm from the ground up. He had sacrificed weekends, missed family dinners, and pulled grueling 80-hour work weeks, drafting blueprints and securing permits. He endured the exhaustion with one singular goal: to ensure his children had an impenetrable financial safety net. He had set up bulletproof college savings accounts, pouring every spare cent of his own income into them. Sydney had always insisted on managing the household finances, claiming his schedule was too demanding. He had trusted her completely. He stared at the final line of the current statement. The numbers blurred together, refusing to make sense. He blinked hard, leaning closer to the glowing screen. The balances were zero. Both accounts were completely, utterly empty. Nearly $400,000 of his hard-earned money, his children's entire future, was simply gone. A cold, nauseating sweat broke out across the back of his neck. He frantically clicked through the transaction history, tracing the outgoing wire transfers. The forensic accountants had painstakingly mapped every single dollar. Sydney had not lost the money in a bad investment. She had systematically drained her children's college funds to finance her own extravagant reality. Terence read the line items, feeling a physical sickness rise in his stomach. $30,000 wired to a luxury boutique in Paris. $80,000 transferred to a high-end jeweler in Manhattan. Frequent massive withdrawals to cover luxury car leases, exclusive country club fees, and lavish vacations she claimed were paid for by her father. She had been stealing from her own flesh and blood to maintain her position in a society that cared nothing for her. But the betrayal did not end there. Terence scrolled further, his eyes burning as he uncovered a secondary web of financial deceit. Hundreds of thousands of dollars had been funneled out of the children's accounts and into a hidden offshore holding company registered under Beverly's maiden name. The attached summary explained everything. Beverly, the supposed matriarch of high society, had accumulated crippling, catastrophic gambling and shopping debts over the years. Rather than face Richard's wrath, Beverly had begged Sydney for help. Sydney, desperate to keep her mother's approval and preserve the family facade, had quietly paid off Beverly's secret creditors, using her own children's tuition money. Terence slammed his laptop shut. The sudden darkness in the car matched the absolute void opening up inside him. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white, as a raw, primal scream tore from his throat. It was a sound of pure agony, the sound of a man realizing his entire life was a carefully constructed fiction. He had worked himself to the bone to provide for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a convenient ATM to fund her delusions. She had called him a useless provider just minutes ago, all while standing on the ashes of the wealth he had literally bled to build for their children. The panic and confusion that had plagued him upstairs vanished, replaced by an icy, terrifying clarity. The good, compliant, long-suffering husband was dead. Terence reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He dialed Sydney's number. It rang twice before she answered. "Terence, please," Sydney sobbed into the receiver, her voice thick with perfect manufactured tears. "Tell me you're getting the loan to save us. We are going to lose everything. You have to fix this." Terence stared straight ahead at the concrete wall, his voice dropping to a pitch of pure, unforgiving ice. "I'm coming home. Pack your bags." The drive from the city to the sprawling Hamptons estate took 2 excruciating hours. For Terence, the journey felt like a funeral procession for a life he had never actually lived. His knuckles remained stark white against the steering wheel as he navigated the winding, manicured roads leading to the 6-bedroom mansion. Every massive oak tree, every perfectly sculpted hedge, and every wrought iron gate he passed felt like a monument to the massive financial lie he had blindly inhabited. He pulled his modest sedan onto the expansive circular driveway, parking directly behind Sydney's gleaming white Porsche Cayenne. He cut the engine, the sudden silence of the car ringing loudly in his ears. He looked up at the towering facade of the house. It was a monument to stolen money. Richard had committed federal fraud to purchase the property, and Sydney had systematically drained her own children's future to furnish it. Terence grabbed his leather messenger bag from the passenger seat, his face set into a mask of pure, immovable granite. He unlocked the heavy mahogany front door and stepped into the grand marble foyer. Sydney was pacing furiously in the center of the sunken living room. She wore a silk designer robe, her hair perfectly tousled, and her mascara artfully smudged beneath her eyes. She had spent the last 2 hours staging the perfect scene of the vulnerable, overwhelmed wife in desperate need of her husband's protection. When she heard the door click shut, she spun around and let out a dramatic, breathless sob. She rushed across the marble floor, throwing her arms out to wrap around his neck. "Terence, thank God you are here!" Sydney cried, pressing her face against his chest, totally ignoring the rigid stiffness of his posture. "I have been terrified. My father is completely losing his mind. Please tell me you went to the bank. Tell me you secured the loans against your architectural firm. We have to transfer the capital immediately to stop Camilla from ruining our family." Terence did not raise his arms to hold her. He stood perfectly still, letting her cling to him for a long, agonizing moment before he reached up, grasped her wrists, and forcefully peeled her hands off his shoulders. He took a deliberate step back, severing the physical contact. Sydney stumbled slightly, her perfectly choreographed expression of distress faltering into genuine confusion. "Terence, what are you doing?" Terence unzipped his leather messenger bag. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. He walked past her, his heavy footsteps echoing sharply in the cavernous room, and slammed the papers down onto the pristine Calicotta marble kitchen island. "These are divorce papers," Terence stated, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm register that Sydney had never heard before. "My attorney drafted the preliminary separation agreement while I was driving. I want your house keys, the keys to the Porsche, and every single credit card in your wallet placed on this counter right now." Sydney stared at the thick stack of paper, her mouth falling open in sheer disbelief. Her eyes darted from the legal documents to Terence's stony face. "Divorce." Sydney shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceiling. "Are you completely insane? My father is under a vicious corporate attack from my deranged sister, and you are throwing a tantrum about our marriage. You are my husband. You are supposed to protect us." Terence reached back into his bag. He pulled out the printed forensic accounting spreadsheets he had extracted from Camilla's encrypted USB drive. He tossed them onto the marble island, right next to the divorce papers. The highlighted rows of zeroed-out balances glared up under the expensive pendant lights. "I saw the internal audit," Terence said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I saw the wire transfers, Sydney. I saw the offshore holding company registered in your mother's maiden name. I saw the $80,000 charges to Manhattan Jewelers and the $50,000 luxury resort bills." Sydney's face drained of all color. The blood rushed from her cheeks, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. She looked down at the accounting sheets, realizing instantly that the impenetrable wall of her financial secrecy had been completely annihilated. "You drained our children's college funds." Terence continued, stepping closer to the island, his anger radiating like heat from a furnace. "You took $400,000 of the money I bled to earn for our kids, and you used it to pay off your mother's secret gambling debts and buy yourself designer clothes. You stole from your own flesh and blood to fund a lie." Sydney panicked. Her carefully constructed victim persona vanished instantly, replaced by vicious, frantic manipulation. She slammed her hands flat against the marble counter, glaring across at him. "I did it for our image," Sydney screamed, her voice cracking with desperate entitlement. "You have no idea the pressure I am under. You know how my parents judge us? They expected a certain standard, Terence. They expect us to live like Blackwoods. You are just a high school history teacher who started a boutique firm. You do not make enough to keep up with my family's social circle. I had to maintain our status. I was protecting our reputation." Terence looked at her as if she were a rotting corpse. The sheer blinding narcissism required to justify stealing from her own children left him breathless. He did not yell. He did not match her hysteria. He simply delivered his verdict with absolute crushing finality. "I compromised my peace to fit into your racist elitist family." Terence said, his words sharp and deliberate as a scalpel. I swallowed every backhanded compliment your father ever made about my background. I ignored every sneer from your mother about my paycheck. I played the good, quiet, accommodating husband because I thought we were building a life together. But I will never let you steal from my children. Sydney gasped, taking a physical step back as if he had struck her. You cannot take the kids. You cannot leave me here. The kids are already packed, Terrence replied smoothly. I called the nanny from the car. They are waiting for me upstairs, and I am not leaving you here, Sydney. You are leaving. What are you talking about? This is my house. This house belongs to Apex Ventures. Terrence corrected her, gesturing to the lavish surroundings. Camilla owns the $15 million defaulted loan your father used to buy this property. She is seizing every asset tied to that stolen capital. You will have a formal eviction notice taped to that front door by tomorrow morning. You have absolutely nothing. Terrence walked around the island. Sydney stood paralyzed by the total collapse of her empire. Terrence reached into her designer handbag resting on the counter. He pulled out her heavy leather wallet, extracting the sleek metal credit cards attached to his accounts. He dropped the empty wallet back onto the marble, picked up the Porsche keys, and turned his back on her. He walked to the base of the grand staircase and called out for his children. 2 minutes later, he walked out the front door, his kids holding his hands, completely ignoring Sydney's frantic, wailing apologies. The heavy mahogany door slammed shut with a resounding thud. Sydney was left entirely alone in the massive, silent mansion. The crushing reality of her absolute ruin pressed down on her. She had no money, no husband, no children, and no home. She collapsed onto the cold marble floor of the kitchen, her designer dress pooling around her. She grabbed her cell phone with trembling, manic fingers and hit her father's speed dial. Richard answered on the first ring, his own voice ragged with panic. Sydney pressed the phone to her ear, tears of genuine, catastrophic terror streaming down her face. Camilla took him. Sydney screamed into the receiver, her voice breaking into a hysterical, breathless shriek. She took Terrence. She took the kids. She took everything. Richard stood frozen in his mahogany-paneled home office, the phone pressed tightly to his ear. Sydney's hysterical shrieks continued to pour from the speaker, blending into a chaotic symphony of pure, unadulterated panic. He did not offer his daughter a single word of comfort. His hand trembled so violently that he dropped the device onto his massive desk, letting her cries echo into the silence of the room until she finally hung up. The ornate grandfather clock in the corner chimed exactly 8 times. The 24-hour deadline had officially expired. Richard had spent the entire night barricaded in that office, frantically burning through his entire contact list. He had called every golfing buddy, every corporate ally, every rival hedge fund manager, and every private equity parasite he had ever entertained at his country club. He had begged, pleaded, and offered catastrophic interest rates for a fast $15 million bridge loan. The responses had been a devastating mix of dialed-out voicemails, awkward coughs, followed by dial tones and flat, unapologetic rejections. The financial world operated on a ruthless grapevine. Word had already spread that the Blackwood Fund was executing a hostile takeover of his logistics empire. Nobody was going to catch a falling knife, especially not one aimed directly at their own wallets. He had failed. The titan of industry was utterly bankrupt. A heavy, rhythmic pounding on the front door shattered the morning stillness of the estate. It was not a polite knock. It was the sharp, authoritative strike of law enforcement. Richard rushed out of his office and stood at the top of the grand, sweeping staircase. The heavy oak double doors were pulled open by his bewildered housekeeper. Standing on the pristine marble porch was a team of uniformed police officers, flanked by 2 sharp-suited attorneys and a crew of burly men in matching gray uniforms. Behind them, idling loudly on the manicured circular driveway, were 3 massive moving trucks. "Are you Richard Sterling?" the lead attorney asked, stepping into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. He held up a thick sheaf of legal documents, bearing a fresh, heavy court seal. "I represent the Blackwood Fund. We are executing the immediate seizure of this property and all non-exempt physical assets within it to satisfy the defaulted corporate loan. This estate is now legally owned by Apex Ventures. You have precisely 1 hour to gather your personal clothing and vacate the premises." Richard's knees buckled slightly. He gripped the polished oak banister to keep from collapsing. The attorneys did not wait for his response. They gestured to the moving crew who immediately flooded into the house carrying clipboards, heavy-duty boxes, and thick rolls of bubble wrap. The invasion was swift, surgical, and entirely merciless. Men began pulling original oil paintings off the walls, carefully cataloging the silver from the dining room and unplugging the high-end electronics. Beverly emerged from the master suite, her face slathered in an expensive morning cream and her body wrapped in a plush silk robe. She stopped dead in her tracks at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide with absolute horror, as two movers hoisted a massive antique vase from its pedestal in the hallway. "What on earth is going on here?" Beverly shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings. "Put that down immediately." She charged down the staircase, practically tripping over her designer slippers. She threw herself in front of a pair of movers who were currently lifting a heavily gilded Louis XV console table right out of her formal sitting room. She slammed her hands down on the polished wood, glaring at the men as if they were vermin. "I said put it down," Beverly commanded, her chest heaving with arrogant fury. "This is a private residence. Do you have any idea who I am?" The larger of the two movers paused, adjusting his grip on the heavy antique. He looked her up and down with an expression of absolute glorious indifference. "Yes, ma'am," the mover replied, his voice completely deadpan. "A tenant in default. Step aside, please." Beverly gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if she had been physically struck. She looked wildly at Richard, who was still clinging to the banister, completely defeated. The reality of her situation finally breached the thick walls of her delusion. She was losing her sanctuary. She was losing the very items she used to prove her superiority over the rest of the world. 45 minutes later, Richard and Beverly found themselves standing on the cold concrete of the street outside their own front gates. They were flanked by a pitiful collection of designer suitcases containing nothing but clothes and basic toiletries. The massive wrought iron gates were chained shut from the inside. A large, bright yellow foreclosure notice was aggressively taped right over the family crest on the mailbox. A battered yellow taxi pulled up to the curb a moment later. The rear door swung open and Sydney dragged herself out. She was a total mess. Her hair was tangled, her makeup was smeared down her cheeks, and she was hauling a single duffel bag. She had been kicked out of her Hamptons mansion the exact same way. She took one look at her parents standing helplessly on the sidewalk and burst into a fresh wave of hysterical tears. "They took the house," Sydney wailed, dropping her bag onto the concrete. "Terrence took the kids. He left me with absolutely nothing. We are homeless." "What are we going to do?" Richard did not answer. He was staring down at his cell phone. A bright banner notification had just illuminated his screen. It was an automated email from the City Business Journal, a newsletter he subscribed to for networking purposes. The headline practically burned itself into his retinas. Apex Ventures CEO Camilla Sterling to host. Annual VIP charity gala tonight at the Grand Atrium. City's elite expected to attend. Richard's vision tunneled. His hands slowly curled into tight, trembling fists. While his family was standing on a public street like discarded trash, the daughter he had thrown away into the freezing rain 20 years ago was preparing to crown herself the queen of the city. She was going to stand in front of the wealthiest, most powerful people in their social circle and bask in the glory of her newfound empire. The sheer blinding humiliation of it ignited a toxic, consuming rage deep within his chest. He shoved the phone screen into Beverly and Sydney's faces. The tears stopped, instantly replaced by the exact same venomous anger that was currently poisoning his own blood. "She planned this perfectly," Richard snarled, his voice dropping into a dangerous, gravelly register. "She timed the foreclosure on the exact same day she intends to celebrate her victory. She wants to parade around like royalty while we sleep in a cheap motel." He grabbed his suitcase, his eyes burning with a dark, reckless intensity. "If she wants to play dirty," Richard declared, "we will ruin her in front of the whole city." The Grand Atrium was bathed in the warm golden glow of thousands of suspended crystal lights. A fleet of black luxury vehicles lined the blocked-off street, depositing the city's most influential figures onto the sprawling red carpet. The guest list was a literal who's who of global finance. Hedge fund managers, tech billionaires, and prominent politicians milled around the entrance, sipping vintage champagne and waiting to gain entry. Apex Ventures was officially unveiling its philanthropic arm, and the media presence was absolutely suffocating. Flashes erupted in a continuous blinding wave. I stood at the center of the step-and-repeat backdrop wearing a custom emerald silk gown that commanded attention without begging for it. Microphones were thrust in my direction as financial reporters and society columnists shouted over one another, desperate for a quote from the woman who had just executed the most ruthless, invisible corporate takeover of the decade. Camilla, rumor has it, Apex Ventures has absorbed 3 major logistics competitors this week. Can you comment on the Blackwood restructuring? One reporter yelled, shoving a recording device toward me. Is it true you are liquidating the Sterling family assets? Another shouted, sensing the blood in the water. I offered a polished, practiced smile, projecting absolute control and unwavering grace. Apex Ventures is committed to modernizing stagnant industries, I replied smoothly, making sure my voice carried clearly over the din of the crowd. But tonight is not about corporate acquisitions or logistics supply chains. Tonight is about giving back. We are here to launch the Apex Youth Foundation. Our primary mission is ensuring that no child is ever discarded, abandoned, or left without a financial safety net. My words were instantly drowned out by a violent, chaotic commotion at the very edge of the security barricades. The polished harmony of the gala shattered in an instant. A heavy velvet rope stand crashed onto the pavement with a sharp metallic clang. 2 of my private security guards shouted harsh commands, moving rapidly to intercept a sudden breach. But the throng of paparazzi naturally parted, their predatory instincts instantly drawn to the raw, unscripted drama spilling onto the red carpet. Richard Beverly and Sydney barged through the opening, completely obliterating the strict black tie dress code of the evening. They looked like wealthy refugees fleeing a sudden catastrophic disaster. Beverly was still clutching the edges of her silk morning robe, her expensive face cream now dried into a flaky pale crust across her cheeks. She was wearing designer slippers that were scuffed and stained from the city sidewalks. Richard was sweating profusely. His tie was loosened, his collar was unbuttoned, and his bespoke suit jacket was heavily wrinkled from a long day spent begging for financial lifelines that never materialized. Sydney trailed closely behind them, hauling a battered canvas duffel bag. Her mascara tracked dark, jagged lines down her cheeks, and her hair was a tangled, frantic mess. The absolute contrast between their disheveled, frantic desperation and the immaculate high society crowd surrounding them was staggering. The entire red carpet fell into a stunned, breathless hush. Before my security team could physically restrain them, Sydney lunged toward the wall of flashing cameras. She dropped her duffel bag onto the red carpet and threw her arms wide, her face twisting into a mask of pure theatrical agony. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. "She is a monster!" Sydney yelled to the paparazzi, her shrill, piercing voice echoing off the glass walls of the atrium. The press corps froze for a fraction of a second before a complete frenzy of camera shutters erupted, immortalizing her breakdown. The blinding white flashes strobed across Sydney's tear-stained face as she leaned into the absolute chaos. "Look at her," Sydney screamed, gesturing wildly in my direction, while reporters aggressively shoved their microphones toward her, the great philanthropist. "She evicted her own mother from our family home this morning. She destroyed my marriage out of pure jealousy. She drove my husband away and stole my children." It was a pathetic, transparent display. Sydney was entirely incapable of taking responsibility for the fact that she had embezzled her own children's college funds to pay off Beverly's secret debts. Instead, she was spinning a narrative where I was the wicked witch, hoping the court of public opinion would somehow overrule a federal fraud investigation. The reporters practically trampled each other to get closer. Questions exploded from the crowd, a chaotic barrage of journalistic hunger. "Are you saying Camilla Sterling orchestrated a hostile takeover of her own family? Did she force your husband to leave you?" Beverly leaned into the spectacle, sensing the cameras locking onto her. She buried her face in her hands and let out a loud, tragic wail, playing the part of the devastated, discarded matriarch to absolute perfection. "We have nothing!" Beverly cried out to the flashing bulbs, her shoulders shaking with manufactured grief. My own daughter threw me onto the street like trash. We do not even have a place to sleep tonight. I did not flinch. I did not break my posture. I simply stood my ground on the red carpet, my expression an impenetrable wall of calm. I knew exactly what they were doing. Stripped of their wealth, their power, and their stolen assets, they were weaponizing the only thing they had left: public sympathy. They wanted to drag me down into the mud with them, hoping the scandal would force me to back down and return their stolen empire. Richard's presence was the most jarring. The man who had always cared more about appearances than his own children was now completely unhinged. He had abandoned all dignity. He shoved past a prominent city councilman, ignoring the shocked gasps of the wealthy elite he used to call his peers. His eyes were entirely bloodshot, burning with a frantic, destructive energy. He was a man who had stared into the abyss of his own ruin and decided to take the entire world down with him. He lunged forward, moving faster than the security guards anticipated, and violently grabbed a microphone straight out of the hands of a startled broadcast reporter. The sudden feedback from the snatched microphone screeched loudly over the PA system, a sharp, piercing noise that forced several elite guests to cover their ears. Richard did not care. He turned his back on the media and pointed the heavy microphone directly at me, his chest heaving as he stared me down with absolute venomous hatred. "She is a fraud!" Richard shouted, his booming, desperate voice echoing down the entire city block. "She preaches to all of you about charity. She stands up here and plays the savior, but she hoards $500 million in a hidden offshore trust for a fictional 20-year-old child, all while her own flesh and blood starve in the streets." The echo of Richard's furious accusation slammed against the vaulted glass ceiling of the grand atrium and faded into an absolute suffocating silence. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The elite hedge fund managers, the politicians with their champagne flutes frozen halfway to their mouths, and the swarm of paparazzi all stood completely paralyzed. The media hounds held their breath, their camera lenses locked onto my face. They were waiting for the inevitable collapse. They expected me to crumble, to weep, to frantically signal my security team to drag my unhinged family away. Richard stood on the red carpet, his chest heaving under his rumpled suit. A triumphant, manic gleam danced in his bloodshot eyes. Beverly and Sydney flanked him, mirroring his vicious satisfaction. They truly believed they had done it. They thought they had just detonated a social grenade that would completely obliterate my reputation and force me to surrender my empire to save my public image. I did not call for security. I did not break eye contact with the man who had sired me. I simply reached out and gently took a microphone from the trembling hands of a nearby financial reporter. I smoothed the skirt of my emerald gown, stepped directly into the blinding glare of the camera flashes, and offered my family a smile, colder than absolute zero. "You are right, Richard," I said, my voice projecting crisp, clear, and perfectly steady through the atrium's state-of-the-art sound system. I did pledge my entire $500 million personal fortune to an offshore trust. I locked every single cent away, ensuring that no creditor, no rival firm, and certainly no estranged bankrupt relatives could ever touch it. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of socialites and investors. The paparazzi went into an absolute frenzy, their cameras firing like machine guns. They had expected a massive denial. Instead, they were getting a live, on-the-record confession to a massive financial conspiracy. Sydney let out a shrill, victorious laugh. "See?" she screamed at the reporters, pointing a jagged fingernail at me. "She admits it. She is a selfish, hoarding sociopath." I ignored her completely, keeping my gaze locked on Richard. The manic triumph in his eyes was beginning to falter, replaced by a creeping, icy dread. He knew me too well to think I would ever surrender this easily. He realized a fraction of a second too late that he had not trapped me. I had baited him onto a global stage. "You called my beneficiary a fictional 20-year-old child." I continued, pacing slowly across the red carpet, commanding the attention of every billionaire and journalist in the room. "You told this crowd that I am hoarding wealth while my flesh and blood starve. But you left out the most important part of the story, Richard. You forgot to tell them why I had to build that safety net in the first place." I turned to face the wall of cameras. 20 years ago, a child was thrown out of her home into the freezing rain. I stated my words ringing with absolute crushing authority. She was discarded by parents who cared more about maintaining their pristine country club image than protecting their own daughter. That child had to dig through dumpsters for food. That child had to sleep in subway stations. That child had to build an empire from absolute nothing because the people who were supposed to love her left her to die. Beverly physically recoiled, her hands flying to her mouth. The wealthy guests surrounding the red carpet began to murmur, casting horrified, disgusted glances at my parents. The narrative was shifting rapidly, slipping entirely through Richard's desperate fingers. "You want to talk about family legacy?" I asked, my voice rising above the murmurs. "You want to talk about charity? You invaded my event tonight, hoping to expose a scandal, but all you have done is provided the perfect introduction for my life's work." I raised my free hand and snapped my fingers sharply, signaling my audio-visual team waiting in the control booth above. "It is time everyone meets my child," I announced. The atrium plunged into sudden dramatic darkness. The only illumination came from the frantic flashing of the paparazzi cameras. Then a massive thunderous bass note vibrated through the floorboards, and the towering digital screens behind the main stage flared to life with blinding brilliance. Every head in the room snapped toward the screens. Richard, Beverly, and Sydney spun around, their faces bathed in the harsh white light of the massive monitors. The screen did not display a birth certificate. It did not show a hidden biological heir. Instead, bold, towering gold letters materialized across the digital display, accompanied by a sleek, modern crest. The Genesis Child. A medical and educational foundation for abandoned and abused youth endowment. $500 million. The crowd erupted. The gasp that tore through the atrium was deafening. The realization struck the press corps like a lightning bolt. The fictional 20-year-old child was not a human being. It was a corporate entity. It was an impenetrable, legally bulletproof philanthropic foundation. I had taken $500 million of my personal wealth and locked it inside an irrevocable charity trust. It was an absolute financial fortress. Below the massive logo, the screen rapidly scrolled through the foundation's core initiatives: free legal advocacy for emancipated minors, full-ride university scholarships for foster children, state-of-the-art pediatric medical care for victims of domestic neglect. I had meticulously designed the Genesis Child to be everything my parents were not. It was a $500 million shield for the vulnerable. By dedicating my fortune to a foundation representing the abused youth I once was, I had ensured that my money would forever remain entirely out of reach of my greedy, parasitic family. Richard's jaw worked silently. He looked at the glowing numbers on the screen. $500 million. That was the exact capital he needed to save his logistics empire. It was right there, staring him in the face, yet it was locked behind a charitable wall. If he tried to sue for it now, he would literally be suing a charity dedicated to saving homeless children. He would be the most despised man on the planet. The flashing cameras swung violently away from me and locked onto Richard, Beverly, and Sydney. The press corps pounced with absolute ruthlessness. "Mr. Sterling," a reporter shouted aggressively, shoving a microphone into Richard's pale, sweat-drenched face. "Are you seriously publicly attacking your daughter for donating $500 million to abused children?" Mrs. Sterling, another journalist, yelled, practically cornering Beverly against the velvet ropes. "Did you actually throw your teenage daughter out into the streets? Is that why you are bankrupt today?" Sydney clamped her hands over her ears, backing away from the aggressive wall of reporters. She tripped over her own duffel bag, stumbling awkwardly onto the red carpet. Richard stood completely paralyzed. The stolen microphone slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered onto the floor. He stared up at the glowing golden letters on the massive screens, the sheer magnitude of his defeat, finally crushing the last of his spirit. He had tried to ruin me by exposing my deepest financial secret, and in doing so, he had just broadcast my ultimate triumph to the entire world. The silence inside the grand atrium was absolute, heavy, and completely suffocating. For a span of 10 agonizing heartbeats, not a single camera shutter clicked. The elite hedge fund managers, the politicians, with their champagne flutes frozen halfway to their mouths, and the ruthless media corps were entirely captivated by the massive digital displays towering above the red carpet. $500 million. An irrevocable charitable trust. A financial fortress built specifically to protect the vulnerable. I bent down in a single fluid motion and retrieved the microphone Richard had dropped onto the red carpet. The sharp squeal of feedback echoed briefly before I silenced it with a practiced, steady grip. I turned my back on my trembling, sweat-drenched father and faced the wall of cameras. "You are absolutely correct, Richard," I said, my voice projecting across the cavernous room with lethal, surgical calm. "I did pledge my entire $500 million empire to my child, but this is not a hidden biological heir. This is a promise. It is time everyone in this room understands exactly why this foundation exists." The paparazzi broke from their collective trance. The blinding strobe of camera flashes resumed with manic, hungry intensity. I walked slowly along the edge of the velvet barricades, locking eyes with the most powerful figures in the city. 20 years ago, a 15-year-old girl woke up in excruciating agony. I began letting the raw, unfiltered truth bleed into the microphone. Her abdomen was painfully swollen. She was terrified, confused, and desperate for the safety and protection of her mother and father. Instead of seeking emergency medical care, her parents looked at her expanding stomach and saw only a catastrophic threat to their pristine country club reputation. They assumed she was pregnant. They assumed she was a scandalous, highly inconvenient liability. I paused, letting my gaze drift slowly over to Beverly. My mother was visibly shrinking into herself, pulling her cheap silk robe tighter around her shaking shoulders as the heavy camera lenses pivoted to capture her horrified expression. "They did not ask questions," I continued, my voice ringing with righteous, unshakable authority. "They did not take her to a doctor. To protect their fragile social standing, they threw their 15-year-old daughter out into the freezing winter rain. They locked the heavy mahogany doors of their estate and left her to die on the streets." A collective gasp ripped through the crowd. Several prominent socialites, women who had routinely dined with Beverly just weeks prior, covered their mouths in genuine visceral shock. "That young girl wandered the city streets for 3 days," I said, holding the audience completely captive. "She collapsed on the pavement, burning with a lethal fever. A stranger found her and carried her to a severely underfunded free clinic on the east side of the city. The doctors there did not ask for a platinum insurance card or a trust fund routing number. They rushed her straight into emergency surgery. They discovered that she was not pregnant. She had a massive, aggressive abdominal tumor that was hours away from rupturing and killing her." I stopped pacing and stood perfectly still under the golden glow of the monitors. I looked directly into the center camera lens. "That free clinic saved her life," I stated, my words striking like a heavy hammer against an anvil. "They saved my life, because that 15-year-old girl was me." The atrium exploded. Reporters shouted over one another, frantically thrusting digital recorders toward the barricades. The wealthy guests stared at Richard and Beverly with undisguised, absolute disgust. The narrative was utterly complete. The elite love a juicy financial scandal, but they absolutely despise a monster. The Genesis child is the foundation I created to ensure this history never repeats itself, I declared, raising my voice to cut through the mounting chaos. This endowment will immediately fund a network of mobile medical units, emergency shelters, and elite legal advocacy teams for emancipated minors. I built this $500 million shield to ensure no teenager ever dies on the streets because of narcissistic, abusive parents. Beverly broke. The crushing weight of her absolute social annihilation was simply too much to bear. She realized in a blinding flash of clarity that she would never show her face in this city again. She would be a permanent pariah, a living cautionary tale of maternal cruelty. She let out a strangled, pathetic sob and turned violently away from the cameras. She shoved past Sydney, slipping frantically on her scuffed designer slippers, and bolted toward the glass exit doors. The paparazzi smelled blood. A pack of aggressive photographers abandoned the main stage and chased after her, their cameras firing relentlessly as she fled into the cold night air, weeping loudly and desperately, covering her face with her hands. Sydney, realizing her mother had abandoned her to the wolves, grabbed her canvas duffel bag and sprinted after Beverly, screaming for the reporters to leave them alone. Richard did not run. He could not run. He stood frozen on the red carpet, a hollow, defeated shell of a man. His bespoke suit suddenly looked like a burial shroud. His face was the color of wet ash. The realization of his complete and total ruin pinned him to the floor. He was bankrupt. He was homeless. And now he was publicly branded as the most despicable villain of the decade. I walked directly up to him. The camera zoomed in tight, broadcasting this final devastating confrontation to news networks across the globe. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. "You came here tonight hoping to humiliate me," I said, my voice echoing crystal clear through the atrium. "You thought you could leverage your foreclosure to manipulate my public image and force a settlement. But you forgot how to calculate risk, Richard." I turned my back on him and faced the audience, delivering the ultimate crushing verdict. This morning, Apex Ventures legally seized a massive estate and $15 million in defaulted physical assets from Richard Sterling. I announced, pointing directly at the broken, shivering man standing behind me. "I want to personally thank him for his involuntary contribution, because that $15 million, it just fully funded our newest free pediatric clinic in the heart of the city." For a fraction of a second, the room was suspended in pure silence. Then the crowd erupted. It was not a polite high society golf clap. It was a deafening, thunderous roar of genuine applause. The billionaires, the politicians, and the journalists cheered in unison, a massive tidal wave of vindication crashing over the red carpet. Richard staggered backward. His legs finally gave out. He collapsed onto his knees on the red carpet, staring blankly at the polished shoes of the security guards, who were now moving in to physically drag him off the premises. I did not watch him fall. I turned away, letting the roar of the applause wash over me, and smiled up at the golden logo shining brightly on the screens above. The deafening roar of applause from the gala attendees washed over the red carpet, a thunderous wave of validation that vibrated through the soles of Camilla's stilettos. The city's absolute elite, the very people Richard had spent his entire pathetic life trying to impress, were currently giving his discarded daughter a standing ovation. They cheered not just for the staggering $500 million endowment, but for the ruthless, beautiful poetry of using Richard's own seized $15 million to fund a free pediatric clinic. The financial reporters and society columnists were practically vibrating with adrenaline, their camera lenses locked onto Richard's shattered expression. He stood completely frozen. His chest heaved erratically beneath his ruined, wrinkled, bespoke suit. The microphone he had stolen just moments prior slipped from his trembling, sweaty fingers and hit the concrete with a sharp thud. The manic, vengeful energy that had propelled him to crash this event had entirely evaporated, replaced by a hollow, creeping terror. He looked wildly at the flashing cameras, searching for a single sympathetic face. He found nothing but disgust. Before the applause could even begin to die down, a new, terrifying sound sliced through the cool night air. It started as a distant, urgent wail bouncing off the surrounding skyscrapers, growing rapidly louder and more aggressive. The unmistakable shriek of approaching police sirens. The crowd on the red carpet parted instinctively. The harsh, strobing glare of red and blue lights illuminated the massive glass facade of the grand atrium, painting the shocked faces of the billionaires and celebrities in chaotic colors. Two heavy police cruisers swerved violently up to the barricades, their tires screeching in protest against the asphalt. They angled their vehicles to completely block the perimeter, sealing off any potential exit. The heavy doors of the cruisers swung open. From the shadows of the atrium's grand entrance, a figure emerged, cutting through the murmuring crowd with precise, lethal steps. It was Jared, Camilla's lead corporate attorney. He looked immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, clutching a sleek black leather folio. He was not acting alone. Flanking him were two broad-shouldered detectives wearing plain clothes and expressions of absolute stony resolve. They moved past the velvet ropes with a heavy, undeniable authority that made even the wealthiest guests immediately step back in deference. Jared stopped directly in front of Richard, looking down at the broken man with a gaze devoid of any mercy. Richard scrambled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the red carpet. He managed to keep his footing, but his posture was completely defeated. "What is this?" Richard rasped, his voice devoid of its usual booming resonance, cracking under the strain of absolute panic. "You already took my house. You took the company. What more do you want?" Camilla stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with her attorney. Her emerald gown caught the flashing lights of the police cruisers. She did not look angry. She looked completely, devastatingly bored. I do not want anything else from you, Richard, Camilla replied smoothly, her voice carrying over the low murmurs of the press. This is not about what you owe me. This is about what you owe the state. Jared opened his leather folio with a sharp, decisive snap. He extracted a single heavy sheet of paper secured inside a plastic evidence sleeve. He held it up high so the surrounding press could clearly capture the document. Richard, that corporate contract you presented to the judge? Jared asked, his voice ringing out with terrifying theatrical clarity. Richard's bloodshot eyes widened. The last remaining color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, translucent white. He opened his mouth to speak, but his vocal cords completely paralyzed. My forensic team proved you forged the signature. Jared continued, taking a deliberate step forward, closing the invisible noose around Richard's neck. You thought you could bypass the audit. You thought you could quietly bleed the Blackwood Fund dry to save your own failing logistics empire. But you left a trail. Sydney let out a high-pitched gasp, stepping away from her father, as if he were suddenly radioactive. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes darting between the police cruisers and the legal documents. In this state, Jared stated his words, falling like heavy iron anvils onto the red carpet. Forging a document to seize corporate assets over $10 million is felony forgery. Off to the side near the edge of the barricades, Beverly realized exactly what was happening. The morning eviction had just been the prelude. This was the final brutal execution. Pure, unadulterated panic seized her entirely. She hiked up the edges of her stained silk morning robe and tried to bolt down the sidewalk, abandoning her husband and daughter without a single second of hesitation. She did not make it 3 steps. 2 uniformed officers who had stepped out of the cruisers easily intercepted her. They grabbed her firmly by the elbows. Beverly thrashed wildly, her scuffed designer slippers sliding awkwardly on the pavement. "Take your hands off me!" Beverly shrieked, her voice cracking with hysterical, desperate entitlement. "I am Beverly Sterling. I am a victim here. My daughter is doing this to me. The officers ignored her pathetic protests. They dragged her firmly back to the center of the red carpet, forcing her to stand right beside her trembling husband. The paparazzi descended like starving wolves, their cameras firing relentlessly to capture the raw, unfiltered humiliation of the city's former elite, being corralled like common criminals. The lead detective stepped forward, his eyes sweeping over the ruined couple. The entire street was dead silent save for the mechanical whir and click of 100 camera shutters documenting the ultimate societal downfall. The detective reached to the back of his belt. Richard and Beverly, the detective, announced, his deep voice carrying absolute immovable authority. "You are under arrest for felony forgery and fraudulent extortion." Richard remained completely frozen. His jaw hung open in utter humiliation. He did not fight. He did not speak. The titan of industry had finally been slaughtered on live television. The detective stepped directly behind Beverly, grabbing her thrashing wrists with practiced, forceful efficiency. She kicked out, weeping uncontrollably, as the reality of a concrete prison cell rapidly materialized before her eyes. Beverly shrieked as cold steel clicked around her wrists. The heavy reinforced doors of the police cruisers slammed shut with a definitive metallic thud. The sound echoed across the barricaded street, cutting off Beverly's hysterical shrieks and officially signaling the absolute end of the Sterling dynasty. Richard followed his wife into custody seconds later. He offered zero resistance. The detectives folded his tall frame into the back of the second cruiser with practiced, unapologetic ease. The man who had spent 3 decades terrorizing boardrooms and ruthlessly manipulating financial markets now looked like a hollowed-out mannequin. The flashing red and blue lights painted his pale, vacant face as the police vehicles pulled violently away from the curb, their sirens piercing the crisp, cold night air. The silence on the red carpet lasted only a fraction of a heartbeat before the media exploded once again. The journalists pivoted flawlessly, their heavy camera lenses tracking the departing squad cars before whipping back around to scan the wreckage left behind. The elite gala attendees, the prominent politicians, and the aggressive hedge fund managers began whispering furiously among themselves. Global fortunes would shift drastically by tomorrow morning. High society alliances were already being rapidly recalculated right there on the pavement. Then the collective predatory gaze of the press corps and the socialites locked onto the final remaining target. Sydney stood completely alone. The absolute desolation of her posture was jarring. She was the undisputed golden child. She was the pristine favored heir who had never been denied a single luxury, a single extravagant vacation, or a single shred of parental affection. Now she was shivering in a heavily wrinkled stained designer dress stranded on a red carpet that fiercely rejected her presence. Her heavy battered canvas duffel bag sat slumped on the concrete at her feet. It was the only tangible thing she had left in the world. The blinding rapid-fire strobes of the paparazzi cameras illuminated the dark, jagged tracks of ruined mascara running down her pale cheeks. Sydney took a trembling, unsteady step forward. The reporters instantly surged against the velvet ropes, aggressively shoving their microphones toward her, barking hostile questions about her knowledge of her father's fraudulent extortion schemes. She ignored the barrage completely. Her bloodshot, terrified eyes were locked entirely on me. She breached the invisible boundary between the chaotic, unforgiving street and the pristine, polished entrance of the grand atrium. My private security team instantly stepped forward, moving with lethal synchronization to form a solid wall of muscle to intercept her. "Stand down." I issued the command softly, but my security detail parted immediately, stepping backward into the shadows without a single sound. I wanted to hear exactly what the golden child had to say. Sydney stumbled forward until she was just 3 feet away. The physical contrast between us was staggering. I stood enveloped in custom emerald silk, radiating immaculate control flanked by immense wealth power and the unwavering respect of the city's most dangerous players. She stood shivering, stripped of her stolen inheritance, reeking of sheer desperation and cheap airport coffee. "Camilla, please." Sydney's voice broke. It was a pathetic, rasping sound that barely carried over the clicking cameras. She fell to her knees, right there on the red carpet, completely abandoning her pride, ignoring the frantic flashes documenting her ultimate degradation. She reached out her manicured, trembling fingers, hovering just inches from the hem of my gown, absolutely terrified to actually touch the fabric. "I have nothing. Terrence took the kids. I don't even have a place to sleep tonight." She choked on a massive, heavy sob, her chest heaving as she stared up at me. The arrogant, untouchable sister who had spent 3 decades aggressively mocking my existence was entirely gone. She looked up at me with wide, desperate, pleading eyes. She was waiting for the familiar safety net. She was waiting for the unconditional, immediate bailout that the Sterling family had always provided for their favorite daughter. She genuinely believed that deep down family loyalty would force me to reach down, help her up, and invite her into the safety and warmth of the billionaire gala. I stared down at her kneeling figure. I felt absolutely nothing. No triumph, no lingering anger, no pity. I felt only a cold, clinical observation of cause and effect. "You have a very selective memory, Sydney." My voice was devoid of any emotion. It was a flat, unyielding statement of absolute fact that effortlessly cut through the noise of the surrounding press corps. Sydney blinked rapidly, highly confused by the total lack of sympathy in my tone. "Let me refresh your recollection." I stepped half a pace closer, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. The media leaned in collectively, capturing every single syllable of our exchange for the morning broadcasts. "I was 15, freezing and bleeding when I asked you for help, Sydney." Sydney physically recoiled, the remaining color completely draining from her tear-stained face as our brutal shared history was violently dragged into the unforgiving light. "You told me not to ruin your sweet 16. I did not wait for her to formulate an excuse. I delivered the final words exactly as she had spoken them to me 2 decades ago, perfectly mirroring the cruel, highly dismissive tone she had weaponized against a dying teenager. "Go find a free clinic. They might have a cot for you." A harsh collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. The veteran reporters lowered their microphones, slightly, genuinely stunned by the sheer, breathtaking cruelty of the revelation. The high society guests stared down at Sydney with naked, unabashed revulsion. I stood tall, feeling the crushing weight of the past, finally permanently severed from my shoulders. The desperate 15-year-old girl, who had shivered in the dark, was gone forever. I did not wait to watch my sister break. I simply turned my back on her weeping, crumpled form. The heavy automated glass doors of the grand atrium glided open silently. The warm, brilliant golden light of the gala spilled out onto the pavement, completely banishing the darkness. I walked inside, moving with absolute purpose. The doors slid shut behind me with a quiet final seal, locking the past exactly where it belonged. Out in the cold. 3 weeks evaporated in a relentless, unyielding media firestorm. The global financial networks and society tabloids absolutely gorged themselves on the total destruction of the Sterling dynasty. Richard and Beverly were immediately stripped of their passports, their remaining frozen bank accounts, and whatever microscopic shreds of dignity they had left. They were currently sitting in separate, heavily monitored federal holding cells, awaiting a highly publicized trial. Jared and his legal team had handed the district attorney a mountain of forensic evidence so perfectly organized, it practically guaranteed a conviction. Richard was looking at a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary for the multi-million-dollar forgery and corporate fraud. Beverly, having actively participated in the fraudulent extortion attempt on live television, was facing a decade behind bars herself. Their country club friends completely abandoned them. The elite socialites who once kissed Beverly's cheek now gave exclusive television interviews expressing their profound disgust at how the Sterlings had treated their youngest daughter. They were completely, utterly ruined, permanently erased from the high society circles they had worshipped. Sydney experienced a spectacular gravity-defying fall from grace. Stripped of the massive allowance she had siphoned from her parents and locked out of her marital assets, the golden child crashed violently into the real world. She was currently living in a damp, aggressively yellow motel room on the extreme industrial outskirts of the city, paying her rent by the week. The woman who used to throw brutal, screaming tantrums over improper thread counts was now working 35 hours a week at a discount retail store just to keep the electricity turned on. Paparazzi occasionally stalked the strip mall, where she folded cheap polyester sweaters, publishing humiliating high-definition photos of the former heiress, clocking in for her minimum wage shifts. Sydney spent her short lunch breaks aggressively refreshing her phone, waiting for a miraculous legal loophole or a secret benefactor to save her. Neither was coming. Her safety net had been completely incinerated. Far above the smog and the scandals, the penthouse office of Apex Ventures remained an impenetrable fortress of calm. I stood at my massive mahogany desk, the morning sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the sprawling architectural blueprints spread out before me. The $15 million seized from Richard's offshore accounts had been completely liquidated and aggressively channeled into the Genesis Child Foundation. I traced a manicured finger over the schematics for the new pediatric wing. It featured state-of-the-art diagnostic imaging centers, an expansive physical trauma unit, and a beautifully designed therapeutic garden for recovering teenagers. It was a masterpiece of modern medicine entirely free for the city's most vulnerable youth. I felt a profound settling peace as I signed the final approval documents. The pain of my past had literally been transformed into the foundation of someone else's future. The sleek digital intercom on my desk chimed softly. My assistant announced a private call on line 1. I tapped the speaker button, continuing to review the electrical schematics for the clinic. "Good morning, Terrence," I said, not bothering to look up from the blueprints. I assume the final court filings went smoothly. A deep, exhausted but undeniably relieved sigh echoed through the speaker. It was Terrence Sidney's former husband, the man she had endlessly belittled and attempted to bankrupt to cover Beverly's hidden debts. "It went better than smoothly," Camilla, Terrence replied, his voice carrying a lightness I had not heard from him in years. "The judge signed the final decree an hour ago. I was granted full exclusive physical and legal custody of the children. Sydney gets supervised visitation every other weekend, assuming she can afford the required monitoring fees." "And the financial separation?" I asked, making a quick notation on the architectural plans with a silver pen. "Airlight," Terrence confirmed. "Because you provided the forensic paper trail, proving Sydney was embezzling our joint savings to fund your parents' failing logistics company. The judge legally insulated all of my personal assets. She cannot touch my business, she cannot touch the kids' college funds, and she receives absolutely zero alimony. I actually retain the family home." I nodded to myself, feeling a sharp spark of satisfaction. "That is excellent news, Terrence. Your children deserve a stable environment far away from the Sterling influence. You protected them perfectly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I heard the faint sound of a coffee cup being set down on a wooden desk. I did not protect them, Camilla Terrence said, his tone shifting into one of profound, genuine gratitude. You did. If you had not sent your legal team to audit my accounts and warn me about the embezzlement, Sydney would have dragged me and the kids straight down into the abyss with her. You saved me from a lifetime of being used as an ATM for a family of parasites. I do not know how to thank you. You just did, I replied smoothly, rolling up the blueprints and sliding them into a protective leather tube. Raise your children well. Teach them the absolute value of honesty and hard work. That is the only thanks I require. Terrence cleared his throat, the atmosphere turning slightly more serious. The district attorney called me this morning regarding your parents. The sentencing hearing for Richard and Beverly is scheduled for next Thursday at noon. The judge is expected to hand down the maximum federal penalties given the extremely public nature of the extortion attempt. He paused, the unspoken weight of our shared brutal history hanging heavily in the silence of the office. Are you going to attend their sentencing hearing? Terrence asked quietly. Do you want to be there to watch them take the plea deal? I picked up the heavy leather tube containing the blueprints for the pediatric clinic. I looked out the massive glass windows, surveying the sprawling, glittering city that I now entirely controlled. I thought about Richard standing in a courtroom in handcuffs. I thought about Beverly wearing a bright orange jumpsuit, completely stripped of her high society armor. I thought about the absolute glorious finality of it all. No, I replied, my voice perfectly steady, carrying absolutely zero regret. I have a ribbon-cutting ceremony to attend. Exactly 1 year after the absolute collapse of the Sterling Empire on the red carpet of the Grand Atrium, the morning sun reflected brilliantly off the pristine glass facade of the Genesis Child Clinic. The transformation of this space was nothing short of miraculous. Where there had once been a barren concrete lot tied to a shell corporation, there now stood a towering beacon of absolute sanctuary. I stood on the immaculate plaza, breathing in the crisp morning air, running my hand along the smooth, sun-warmed stone of the entrance pillars. There were no velvet ropes here. There were no flashing paparazzi strobes hunting for scandal or weakness. There was only the quiet, undeniable weight of a promise completely fulfilled. The $500 million endowment built directly upon the ruins of my father's $15 million offshore extortion fund had materialized into the most advanced pediatric trauma and recovery center in the country. It was a masterpiece of modern medicine featuring state-of-the-art diagnostic imaging centers, an expansive physical therapy unit, and a beautifully designed therapeutic garden, all entirely free for the city's most vulnerable children. The news cycle over the past 12 months had thoroughly and systematically annihilated the Sterling legacy. Every forged signature, every hidden debt, and every desperate attempt at corporate extortion had been dragged into the brutal light of public scrutiny. Richard and Beverly were currently sitting in separate, heavily monitored federal holding cells. They had been denied bail and were awaiting a highly publicized trial that guaranteed them decades in federal prison. The elite society they had worshipped had completely erased them from existence. Sydney had experienced an equally spectacular fall from grace. Stripped of her massive allowance and legally locked out of her marital assets, the golden child was now living in a cheap, damp motel room on the industrial outskirts of the city. The woman who used to throw brutal tantrums over improper thread counts was now working a minimum wage retail job just to keep the lights turned on. The low, steady purr of an approaching engine drew my attention to the circular driveway. A modest, dark blue SUV pulled up to the curb. The rear doors swung open before the vehicle had even completely settled into park. Two small, vibrant tornadoes of energy erupted onto the sidewalk. My niece and nephew sprinted across the plaza, their bright laughter echoing off the glass walls. They did not walk with the rigid, highly anxious posture required in the Sterling household. They were not wearing stiff, uncomfortable designer clothes chosen solely to impress judgmental country club peers. They wore scuffed sneakers, brightly colored jackets, and expressions of pure, unadulterated joy. They crashed into my legs simultaneously, wrapping their small arms around me in a fierce, genuine embrace. Terrence walked up behind them carrying a camera and a look of profound, settled peace. The deep exhaustion carved trenches that used to bracket his eyes had completely vanished. The crushing weight of attempting to appease Beverly's impossible standards and Sydney's manic financial demands had been entirely lifted from his shoulders. He looked 5 years younger, radiating the quiet, absolute confidence of a man who finally had complete control over his own life and the safety of his children. He placed a warm, steady hand on my shoulder, looking up at the towering medical facility. He did not need to speak. The vibrant, thriving health of his children was the only testament required. They were completely free from the toxic, suffocating influence of their grandparents. They were safe and they were finally allowed to just be children. A respectful, murmuring crowd began to gather around the entrance. Unlike the elite gala attendees who operated entirely on calculated self-interest, this crowd was composed of dedicated medical professionals, city social workers, and families whose lives were about to be fundamentally changed. The mayor stepped up to the podium, delivering a brief, gracious speech regarding the unprecedented scale of the Genesis Endowment. I stood quietly, letting the political platitudes wash over me. My focus was entirely drawn to the right side of the main entrance, where a heavy velvet curtain veiled a solid bronze plaque embedded directly into the foundational stone. I walked over and smoothly pulled the curtain away. The morning light caught the polished bronze lettering. It did not bear my name. It did not mention the massive corporate war, the seized assets, or the brutal revenge that had funded the concrete beneath our feet. The inscription was devastatingly simple. It honored the exact names of the two exhausted, underpaid emergency room doctors at a rundown free municipal clinic who had worked a grueling night shift 20 years ago. The doctors who had taken in a freezing, bleeding 15-year-old girl who had been violently turned away by her own sister. The doctors who had asked absolutely zero questions about insurance or wealthy benefactors and had simply saved my life. I traced the etched letters with my fingertips, feeling the cold metal anchor me to the absolute reality of my victory. I had taken the ultimate defining trauma of my youth and actively forged it into an unbreakable legacy of power and healing. An official stepped forward, handing me a pair of heavy ceremonial silver scissors. A wide, bright red ribbon stretched across the double glass doors, serving as the final barrier between the clinic and the city. I stepped up to the center of the ribbon. My niece and nephew flanked me, their small hands resting lightly on my waist, completely oblivious to the dark history that had led to this exact moment of light. I looked out over the gathered crowd. I positioned the heavy silver blades around the red silk. With one sharp, definitive motion, I sliced through the fabric. The applause that erupted was not the thunderous, sycophantic roar of the high society red carpet. It was a wave of genuine, heartfelt gratitude that resonated deeply within my chest. As the heavy glass doors automatically parted, inviting the first patients into the sunlit, welcoming atrium, a profound realization washed over me. I was not thinking about Richard in his federal holding cell. I was not thinking about Beverly stripped of her vanity. I was not even thinking about Sydney bitterly folding cheap sweaters to pay for a motel room. They were entirely, spectacularly irrelevant. I had spent years meticulously orchestrating their downfall, executing a flawless, unyielding strategy of retribution. But the best, most absolute revenge was not merely destroying my abusers. The sweetest piece was making them entirely irrelevant to my spectacular success. I smiled, stepping forward into the brilliant morning light, leaving the sterling ghosts behind me forever. The most profound lesson from these narratives is that true security and self-worth must come from within rather than from the validation of a toxic family. When faced with relentless belittlement and betrayal by those who should protect us, the answer isn't bitter retaliation. Instead, the ultimate victory is achieved by quietly building an independent life and rendering those abusers completely irrelevant to your future. Blood does not excuse abuse, and walking away to protect your peace is a profound act of courage. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to find your true strength? Share your experience and comment below.